I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the light harsh against the dim shadows of the recovery room. The digital receipt in my inbox bore a completion stamp of 2:14 in the afternoon. I slowly turned my head. On the white dry erase board across the room, a nurse had scribbled the details of my daughter Hazel and her birth. Time of delivery, 2:14 in the afternoon. At the exact minute my body was tearing to bring a child into the world, someone had digitally signed my name to surrender my apartment lease. A voicemail icon sat at the top of my screen. The caller ID read, Elise, my sister. I tapped the play button with a heavy thumb. Her voice filled the quiet room, sweet and rehearsed, the tone she uses right before a lie. "Hey, Georgie," she said. "I just got off the phone with Mr. Sterling. I told him you are moving out. We needed the deposit back, the full $9,200. Mom needs it for her surgery copay. I knew you would want to help her. You will understand once the baby comes." Before the line disconnected, I heard it, the distinct, crisp sound of ice clinking against glass. She was drinking a cocktail while making me homeless. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where we tell the stories of families who push too far and the quiet ones who finally push back. If you have ever been the person expected to swallow your own ruin just to keep the peace, this story is going to hit close to home. Drop a comment and let me know your age and where you are listening from. And make sure to subscribe. Let me tell you who I am before they try to rewrite my history. My name is George Ember. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a senior data auditor in Indianapolis. I track missing capital for a living. I find the hidden ledgers. I live by numbers because numbers do not lie. People do. But there is no spreadsheet for the blinding pain of a 30-hour labor. The epidural had worn off somewhere around hour 20. My throat was raw from breathing through the final pushes. Resting on my chest in a thin hospital blanket was Hazel. She was exactly 2 hours old. The air in the room felt thick with the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. Panic is a luxury for people who have a safety net. I assessed the triage board of my reality. I had an empty bank account, a newborn in my arms, and a hospital discharge looming in less than 48 hours. Elise had impersonated me, terminated my lease, and routed my savings to an unknown destination. The justification was a hollow fabrication. If our mother Helen actually required an emergency medical procedure, she would have broadcast the tragedy across every country club in Marion County. There was no surgery. There was only theft. Elise had calculated my physical exhaustion. She assumed the sheer trauma of childbirth would render me docile. She gambled our entire family dynamic on the belief that I would absorb this financial blow to maintain the facade of peace. She expected me to cry and figure it out quietly. She made a fatal miscalculation. She forgot she was stealing from a woman whose entire career is built on balancing the books. I adjusted my posture against the stiff hospital pillows, ignoring the sharp, stinging protest of my torn muscles. Hazel stirred in her sleep, a small, radiating warmth anchoring my chest. With my left hand, I cradled the fragile curve of her neck. With my right hand, I opened the voice memo application on my phone. My state requires only one party to consent to an audio recording. I tapped the red circle. The timer began to count the seconds. I opened my contacts and dialed Richard Sterling. Sterling manages 36 residential properties across the north side of Indianapolis. He is a man who builds his wealth on the margins, favoring rapid tenant turnover over structural maintenance. During my 3 years renting from him, I learned he valued speed above legality. I listened to the line ring, regulating my breathing. In my line of work, the initial contact is critical. Fraudsters always reveal their underlying anxiety in the first 10 seconds of a confrontation. The line connected with a loud click. "George, congratulations," Sterling said. His voice carried a manufactured warmth, loud and overly familiar. "Your sister called me earlier with the good news. I hope you and the new baby are resting up." I did not return the greeting. I did not match his tone. I kept my voice flat, unyielding, and clinical. It is the exact cadence I reserve for hostile corporate audits when I find a discrepancy in the ledger. Richard, I am looking at a mutual lease termination agreement you processed this afternoon. I need you to explain how my digital signature ended up on that document. The manufactured warmth evaporated. A heavy, uncomfortable pause stretched across the line. I heard the faint squeak of a leather office chair shifting as he adjusted his weight. "Your sister handled it," he said, his tone suddenly defensive. "She logged into your tenant portal. She had your password, George. She paid the balance and signed the release. I assume she was acting as your proxy since you were in the hospital. She said you needed the cash, liquid, for a family medical emergency." I traced the edge of Hazel's blanket with my thumb. At 2:14 this afternoon, I said my words, slow and deliberate. I was actively pushing a child out of my body. My medical chart, monitored by a team of attending physicians, proves I was physically incapable of authorizing an early vacancy. A lease does not have a legal power of attorney. So I will ask you again, why did you accept a forged signature to break a binding legal contract? He exhaled loudly, a sound of profound annoyance rather than guilt. "You are overreacting," he countered. "She had the login credentials. As far as my system is concerned, that constitutes digital consent. I acted in good faith to help you out of a tight spot." "Good faith requires identity verification," I replied, "especially when waiving a 30-day notice and returning a security deposit without a final property walkthrough. Landlords in this city do not rush to refund $9,000 on a Friday afternoon out of the kindness of their hearts." "What did she offer you, Richard?" Silence hung in the air again. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he weighed the risk of lying against the risk of telling the truth. He thought he was dealing with a distraught, exhausted new mother. He assumed I lacked the energy to dissect a real estate transaction. He did not realize I track missing millions through labyrinthine corporate shell companies for a living. A 2-bedroom apartment lease was child's play. "Your sister was highly motivated," Sterling finally muttered, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial murmur. "She offered a compromise. She agreed to let me retain the final month of rent as a marketing fee, plus a $2,000 expedition charge pulled directly from the deposit. The remaining balance went to the routing number she provided." The pieces snapped into place. Sterling had not just been negligent, he had been bribed. I flipped the unit this afternoon to a new couple relocating from Chicago. Sterling continued gaining confidence now that his secret was out. They paid 6 months up front. "My maintenance guy already boxed up your belongings and moved them down to the basement storage lockers. I did you a favor, George. I saved you the cleaning penalty and the hassle of moving while recovering. You should be thanking me." By state law, I stated, ignoring his attempt to paint himself as a savior, a property owner cannot withhold deposit funds for undefined marketing fees without written consent and a 30-day itemized waiting period. You knowingly bypassed state real estate regulations to pocket an illegal kickback. "Now listen here," Sterling snapped, his temper flaring. "Take it up with your sister. I have a signed document and a leased apartment. Do not call my office making accusations when your own family is running your affairs." The line went dead. I lowered the phone and stopped the recording. I had his verbal confession. He admitted to accepting a fraudulent signature in exchange for an illicit financial cut. He had just handed me the exact rope I needed to hang his real estate license out to dry. But a recorded confession does not provide a warm place for a newborn to sleep tonight. I immediately dialed the local police precinct asking for the fraud division. A dispatcher routed me to a desk sergeant named Miller. I outlined the situation with cold precision. I provided the timeline, the forged document, the IP discrepancy, and the unauthorized wire transfer. Sergeant Miller listened patiently, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh bureaucrats use right before they refuse to do their jobs. "Ma'am, because the suspect is an immediate family member who previously had access to your apartment and personal devices, this falls into a gray area," Miller explained. "We cannot prove she did not have your verbal permission to act on your behalf prior to your admission to the hospital." "She stole $9,000 and made me homeless," I pressed, keeping the panic out of my voice. The landlord admitted to taking a cut. Without a court order proving malicious intent, the department views this as a civil dispute. Miller replied, his tone final and unyielding. You will need to file a complaint in small claims court or hire a civil litigator. We cannot dispatch officers to arrest your sister or force the landlord to evict his new tenants based on a family disagreement. I am sorry, ma'am. He hung up. I sat alone in the dim hospital room, the sterile machinery humming a steady rhythm beside my bed. The trap had closed around me with suffocating efficiency. The law built to protect property owners and delay justice offered no immediate sanctuary. I was physically broken, tethered to an intravenous strip and bleeding onto a hospital pad. The discharge clock was ticking down. In less than 48 hours, the nurses would remove my wristband, place me in a wheelchair, and wheel me out to the curb. I had nowhere to direct the cab. My furniture was in a damp basement locker. My savings were gone. I looked down at Hazel. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a peaceful, oblivious rhythm. The instinct to weep rose in my throat, hot and acidic, but I forced it back down. Tears would not audit the missing funds. Tears would not secure a roof over my child. Elise had weaponized my vulnerability, assuming my temporary weakness was permanent. She had orchestrated a masterclass in betrayal, but she had left digital footprints everywhere. I needed to find the destination of that wire transfer. I needed to understand why Elise required that specific sum of money so desperately that she would risk a felony to obtain it. The answer was hidden somewhere in her digital ledger, and I was going to rip it open. Before I could formulate my next tactical move, the heavy wooden door to my recovery room swung open. It was not a doctor doing rounds. It was not a nurse checking my vitals. Our mother walked into the room. Helen wore a pristine cream-colored linen pantsuit, her hair freshly blown out and perfectly styled. She carried a bouquet of cheap, plastic-wrapped carnations from the hospital gift shop. She smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. She looked radiant. She looked vibrant. She looked absolutely nothing like a woman who required emergency surgery. Helen floated into the sterile white box of my recovery suite like a dignitary visiting a disaster zone. She wore a tailored cream linen suit that looked as though it had just been pressed. Her hair fell in perfectly sculpted waves defying the humid Indiana summer afternoon. In her left hand, she gripped a small cluster of pink carnations wrapped in crinkling, clear plastic. The generic gift shop sticker remained plastered across the barcode. She placed the flowers on the rolling tray next to my untouched lunch, keeping a careful distance from the edge of my bed. She did not lean down to embrace me. She did not reach out to cradle her newborn granddaughter. Helen avoids physical contact when she is wearing dry-clean-only fabrics. I observed her face closely. Her complexion radiated the sun-kissed glow of someone who spends 3 mornings a week at an exclusive tennis clinic. Her eyes were bright, her posture immaculate, her breathing steady and deep. If she harbored a life-threatening illness requiring an immediate cash-funded surgical intervention, her biology was staging a miraculous cover-up. She looked down at Hazel, offering a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "She is precious, George," she said. "You look exhausted, though. You really need to focus on your recovery right now. Let the family handle the stressful details." I kept my voice devoid of inflection. "What surgery, Mother?" Helen shifted her weight, breaking eye contact. She focused her attention on rearranging the cheap carnations inside their plastic sleeve, treating the mundane task with exaggerated importance. "It is a preventative procedure," she murmured, her tone adopting a rehearsed, hushed quality. "My doctor found some concerning markers during my last physical. We needed to secure a specialist immediately. They require an upfront retainer to hold the operating theater for next month. It is all terribly stressful, and I did not want to burden you while you were pregnant." The lie was so poorly constructed, it insulted my intelligence. The American healthcare system does not demand $9,200 via an unverified wire transfer from a third-party landlord to schedule a preventative surgery 4 weeks in advance. Hospitals require insurance authorizations, payment plans, and credit card holds. They do not operate on the frantic same-day cash demands of a hostage negotiation. I am a data auditor. I read complex billing codes and trace hidden financial liabilities for recreation. She was feeding me a script written by someone who had never actually paid a catastrophic medical bill in her life. "You let Elise steal my security deposit," I stated, refusing to entertain her fiction. "You allowed her to cancel my lease while I was physically incapacitated." Helen let out a sharp, dramatic sigh. She crossed her arms, adopting the familiar posture of a weary mediator dealing with a difficult child. "Do not use words like steal, George. It sounds so hostile and unnecessary. Elise merely expedited a transfer to help me. You have always been the strong one. You have a good salary and a stable career. Elise is struggling right now. She panicked trying to help her mother in a crisis. Family helps family. We assumed you would gladly offer the money once you understood the stakes." The demand for blind forgiveness hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. It was a toxic dynamic forged decades ago in my childhood home. When I was 14 years old, I spent 3 weeks building a complex, solar-powered desalination model for the state science fair. 2 days before the exhibition, Elise took my presentation board, scratched out my name, and submitted it under her own to secure a biology grant. When I discovered the theft, Helen intercepted me in our kitchen. She used the exact same pacifying tone she was using right now. "Elise needs this grant for her college applications, George. You are smart enough to build another one. You will figure it out." I was always expected to absorb the losses because I possessed the resilience to survive them. Elise was allowed to shatter the china, and I was expected to walk barefoot across the broken pieces to sweep it up. I adjusted the flannel blanket around Hazel, feeling the steady rhythm of my daughter's tiny heartbeat against my collarbone. "I have nowhere to live, Helen," I said, keeping my gaze locked on hers. "The locks are changed. All of my belongings are sitting in a damp basement storage unit. You cannot justify this." Helen took a step back, her expression hardening into something cold and sharp. She dropped the benevolent matriarch act entirely. "You are being hysterical," she snapped. "Your hormones are severely out of balance from the delivery. I told Elise you would react this way. You always manufacture drama when things do not center around you. We will help you find a new apartment once you calm down. But right now, your erratic behavior is exactly why Liam was so concerned." The mention of my ex-fiancé sent a cold spike of adrenaline directly through my chest. "Why are you talking to Liam?" I asked, my grip tightening instinctively around my baby. Helen smoothed the pristine lapel of her linen jacket, looking thoroughly pleased with herself. "I bumped into his mother at the country club this morning. I simply mentioned that you were going through a sudden housing transition and feeling a bit overwhelmed by single motherhood. We are all just worried about the baby George. You need a stable environment. And right now you are acting completely unhinged." The strategy crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. The surgical copay was nothing but a red herring. Helen was acting as the family enforcer, deploying a textbook gaslighting campaign to neutralize my righteous anger. She was actively weaving a narrative of my supposed mental instability, planting seeds of doubt with wealthy gossips and my ex-fiancé's powerful family. She believed if she framed me as a hormonal, erratic new mother, no one would believe my legitimate claims of real estate fraud. She was isolating me, painting herself and Elise as the concerned caretakers, dealing with an ungrateful, dangerous daughter. But as I watched her check her gold designer wristwatch, a deeper realization settled over my analytical mind. Helen genuinely seemed to believe the money was intended for a medical retainer. Elise had lied to our mother, too. Elise was using Helen's inherent narcissism and endless desire for public sympathy to mask the true destination of the stolen funds. Helen was just a pawn wrapped in expensive linen, deployed to run interference while Elise finalized the real transaction. Helen picked up her designer handbag from the visitor chair. "I will let you sleep," she said smoothly, her voice returning to its deceptive sweetness. "Think about what I said. We can move past this ugly episode once you apologize to your sister for making such horrible accusations." She turned and exited the room, her heels clicking softly down the linoleum corridor until the sound faded completely. I was left alone with the rhythmic hum of the medical monitors and a terrifying new reality. My own mother was willingly laying the groundwork to declare me an unfit parent just to protect her favorite child. I needed to trace that wire transfer immediately before the false narrative spiraled out of my control and reached a judge. I reached for my phone to open my secure banking application, determined to pull the routing codes from the forged digital receipt. Before my thumb could authenticate the login, the heavy wooden door pushed open once again. My older brother Thomas walked into the room, his wife Sarah trailing closely behind him. Thomas carried a thick white envelope in his right hand, his jaw set in a tight, grim line. The second wave of the family assault had arrived, and this one was carrying cash. Thomas pushed through the heavy wooden door of my recovery room, bringing the distinct scent of spearmint gum and dry-cleaned wool into the stagnant hospital air. His wife Sarah shadowed him closely, her posture rigid and her steps silent. Thomas is 3 years older than me. He serves as a junior vice president at a regional logistics firm, a man who treats every family interaction like a shareholder meeting. He measures his personal worth by the lack of visible friction in his life, preferring polished surfaces over hard truths. Sarah carried a sleek leather handbag, keeping her hands tightly clasped in front of her. She did not look at me. She did not cast a single glance toward the baby resting on my chest. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, acting as a silent, complicit accessory to her husband's damage control mission. Thomas approached the side of my bed. He kept a measured physical distance, maintaining the boundary of a hostile corporate negotiation. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not inquire about his newborn niece. "Mom called us from her car," he murmured, his tone hushed and conspiratorial. He glanced toward the closed door, as if an audience of reporters lurked in the corridor. "She said you were threatening to call the police on Elise." I adjusted my grip on Hazel, feeling the dull, persistent ache in my lower spine. "I am not threatening anything," I replied, keeping my vocal register flat and steady. Elise forged my signature on a binding legal contract. She diverted my security deposit into an unknown offshore account. The police require a civil order to intervene, but the empirical facts remain. She stole my home while I was in active labor. Thomas sighed heavily. He ran a hand over his perfectly styled hair, his jaw tightening in profound annoyance. "You always categorize every minor infraction as a federal crime, George," he whispered, leaning closer. He smelled faintly of expensive cedar cologne. Elise made a rash decision. She panicked. Mom needed cash for a medical retainer, and Elise found a shortcut. It was foolish, yes, but it was not a calculated heist. You are letting your postpartum hormones dictate your reaction. The term postpartum hormones struck the air between us like a physical blow. Helen had already embedded her false narrative into his mind. My brother, a man who analyzes supply chain logistics for multi-million-dollar corporations, was choosing to ignore basic financial fraud because acknowledging it would require him to hold his favorite sister accountable. He preferred the narrative of my emotional instability because it required zero emotional effort on his part. I studied his face in the dim fluorescent light. His eyes shifted away from mine, fixing instead on the steady green line of the heart monitor. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. He just needed me to play along. "We cannot have police knocking on the door of the family home," Thomas continued, his voice dropping another octave. "Think about the optics, George. I am up for a senior partnership next quarter. Sarah has her charity board elections next month. A public investigation involving fraud and eviction will humiliate all of us. You cannot drag our names through the mud over a simple misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated. The word tasted metallic and sour in my mouth. "My belongings are sitting in a damp basement locker. My apartment is leased to strangers. I have an infant and $0 in my checking account. How exactly do you suggest I handle this misunderstanding, Thomas?" He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, unsealed, white envelope. He set it down on the plastic tray table next to my untouched hospital lunch. The paper made a soft, heavy thud against the plastic. "I pulled some cash for you," he said, his posture relaxing a fraction now that he was executing his transactional solution. "There is $1,000 in there. It is all crisp $100 bills. Take it. Find a decent motel on the south side for a few weeks. Buy some formula and diapers. Rest up. We will figure out a long-term apartment situation later, once tempers cool down. Just stop being difficult. Let it go." I stared at the white envelope. The stark reality of his gesture settled deep into my bones, chilling me more than the cold hospital draft. This was not an act of sibling generosity. This was a gag order. He was purchasing my silence at a steep discount. He viewed my catastrophic crisis as a minor public relations issue to be swept under a cheap motel rug. He expected me to react with predictable pride. He anticipated I would reject the money out of a sense of moral superiority, or perhaps break down into hysterical sobs, thereby proving his theory of my emotional fragility. In the past, the old version of me would have thrown the envelope back at his chest. The old version of me craved their validation and demanded justice through righteous anger. But the old version of me did not have a daughter sleeping against her ribs, entirely dependent on my ability to survive. I reached out with my free hand. My fingers brushed the smooth, thick texture of the paper envelope. I picked it up. I flipped the flap open. 10 crisp $100 bills stared back at me, their green ink sharp and pristine against the harsh lighting. "Thank you, Thomas," I said softly. My voice carried no trace of sarcasm, no hint of bitterness. I made my tone small, defeated, and compliant. "I appreciate the help. I will find a place today." Thomas blinked, his expression briefly registering pure shock. He had braced himself for a war of words. He had prepared a dozen rebuttals for my expected outrage. My sudden submission derailed his entire script. He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for a hidden trap. Finding none, a smug, self-satisfied smile crept onto his features. He had won. He had successfully managed the crisis and contained the damage without breaking a sweat. "Of course, Georgie," he replied, his tone suddenly dripping with magnanimous warmth. He even reached out and awkwardly patted the edge of my mattress, avoiding actual physical contact. "We are family. We take care of each other. Just focus on the baby and let the rest of this blow over." Sarah offered a tight, wordless nod, her eyes still avoiding my gaze. They turned in unison and exited the room, leaving behind the lingering scent of cedar and spearmint. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me back into the quiet solitude of the recovery ward. I set the envelope down on my chest, resting my hand over the crisp bills. Thomas believed he had purchased my silence. He assumed $1,000 would force me into a dark motel room where I would quietly fade into the background. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of an auditor. He did not realize he had just funded my forensic investigation. He had just provided the exact liquid capital I needed to purchase the physical evidence of his sister's crime. This cash was my Chekhov's gun, loaded and waiting to be fired. I closed my eyes, formulating the precise chronological steps required to weaponize this money. My mind calculated the distance to the property management office, the cost of bribing an underpaid receptionist, and the timeline for securing the internal communication logs. I had the means to strike back. I just needed to bypass the hospital discharge protocols. My tactical planning was abruptly interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic vibration. My phone buzzed against the plastic tray table. The screen lit up, piercing the dim hospital gloom. I reached for the device, assuming it was another pacifying text from Helen or a panicked follow-up from Thomas. Instead, my email client displayed a new, high-priority notification. The sender name sent a fresh wave of cold adrenaline crashing through my exhausted system. It was Liam, my former fiancé, the biological father of the child sleeping in my arms. Liam and I had severed our relationship 7 months ago. He is a man who deals exclusively in leverage and optics. His family possesses generations of Indiana wealth, wielding significant political influence across the state. Liam never desired a child. He had made that abundantly clear during our final argument. However, his prominent family demanded a respectable heir to continue their legacy. An out-of-wedlock child born to an unhoused mother would be a public relations nightmare for his upcoming local political campaign. I tapped the screen, opening the message. The text was brief, composed with the sterile, threatening precision of a legal proxy. "George," the email began, "my mother informed me of your sudden eviction and your erratic behavior today. I understand you currently have no fixed address and no financial means to provide a safe environment for my daughter. My attorney is filing an emergency petition for primary custody first thing Monday morning. Do not attempt to leave the county." The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving me dizzy and breathless. Helen had not merely gossiped at her country club. She had actively armed my greatest threat. She had served my vulnerability to Liam on a silver platter, confirming every false narrative Elise had constructed. The parameters of the war instantly shifted. The stakes were no longer confined to a stolen security deposit or a lost apartment. The conflict had mutated into a battle for my child. Elise stealing my home had handed Liam the exact ammunition he needed to strip me of my motherhood. I looked down at the envelope of hush money resting against Hazel. I had less than 48 hours to secure verifiable housing, recover my stolen assets, and build an airtight legal defense from a hospital bed. The walls were closing in fast. I read the digital text glowing on my phone screen a second time, analyzing the stark, clinical vocabulary my former partner had chosen. Liam did not ask about Hazel's birth weight. He did not inquire about her length or the color of her eyes. He did not ask if my labor was complicated or if I was recovering well. He bypassed human decency entirely and proceeded straight to litigation. The message was not a congratulatory note from a new father. It was a formal declaration of war, drafted by a man who viewed our daughter not as a life to be nurtured, but as a liability to be managed. Liam and his family operate on a different stratum of Indiana society. They possess generational wealth built on decades of regional manufacturing monopolies and commercial real estate development. Their surname is plastered across university science wings and hospital donation plaques. When I ended our engagement 7 months ago, citing his chronic infidelity and fundamental lack of partnership, Liam was relieved. He never desired the constraints of fatherhood. He preferred the unencumbered lifestyle of a wealthy bachelor. However, the political landscape had shifted since our separation. His family was currently positioning him for a highly contested local office, grooming him for a seat that required an impeccable public image. A candidate championing family values cannot afford the scandal of an out-of-wedlock child born to a destitute mother. Conversely, a candidate who heroically steps in to rescue his infant daughter from an erratic homeless woman projects strength, responsibility, and paternal virtue. Hazel was no longer a burden to him. She was a campaign prop. My mind raced, auditing the legal threat with the same rigorous scrutiny I apply to corporate risk assessments. In family court, a judge prioritizes the safety and stability of the child above all else. Elise canceling my lease had not merely inconvenienced me. Her greed had handed Liam the exact judicial ammunition required to strip me of my maternal rights. A magistrate evaluating an emergency custody petition on a Monday morning would look at the empirical evidence. They would see a mother with no fixed address, her belongings packed into a basement storage unit, and a bank account drained to zero. They would see a woman discharged from a medical facility with nowhere to bring a fragile newborn. The crisp $100 bills Thomas had left on my tray suddenly felt like a trap. If I used that cash to secure a cheap, transient motel room on the outskirts of the city, I would be walking directly into Liam's legal snare. A roadside motel is not a verifiable permanent residence. A judge would view a temporary room rental as proof of my instability. Thomas thought he was buying my silence, but following his advice would guarantee the loss of my child. A cold tremor started at the base of my neck and radiated down my spine, competing with the lingering ache of my torn muscles. The sheer scale of the coordinated assault was breathtaking. Elise lit the match by stealing my security deposit, but Helen had gleefully fanned the flames. By gossiping at her exclusive country club, Helen had deliberately seeded the narrative of my emotional fragility to the exact people who could wield it against me. My mother and my sister were an ecosystem of destruction, working in tandem to dismantle my life while pretending their hands were clean. I looked down at the tiny, sleeping infant resting against my chest. Hazel let out a soft, rhythmic sigh, her miniature fingers curled into tight fists. She was entirely oblivious to the bureaucratic machinery grinding into motion to separate us. The instinct to curl into a defensive posture, to weep and beg for mercy from the people tearing my world apart, flared briefly in my chest. I suffocated that instinct immediately. Begging is an admission of powerlessness. I am an auditor. When the ledger is unbalanced, you do not cry over the missing capital. You track the discrepancy, you identify the fraudulent variable, and you execute a recovery strategy. I had 48 hours until the hospital administration terminated my medical insurance coverage and forced my discharge. I defined the immediate variables. I needed a secure, verifiable residential address to neutralize the emergency custody petition. I needed a location that projected affluence and stability, an address that Liam's high-priced attorneys could not attack in a courtroom. I could not sign a new lease because a lease had drained my liquid assets, and my credit file would reflect the sudden suspicious vacancy. There was only one location in Marion County that fulfilled the strict legal criteria for a stable environment. The realization turned my stomach thick and nauseating. To defeat the external threat, I had to willingly surrender to the internal one. I had to swallow my pride, abandon my independence, and crawl back to the very people who had orchestrated my ruin. I had to ask Helen for sanctuary. It was the ultimate tactical retreat. By requesting permission to move into my mother's finished basement, I would solve the custody address requirement instantly. Helen resided in a pristine, gated community. No family court judge would question the safety or stability of that zip code. Furthermore, moving into the family home would feed Helen's insatiable need to play the savior. She would embrace the opportunity to parade her broken, dependent daughter in front of her peers, proving her narrative of my instability was correct all along. But there was a secondary, far more dangerous advantage to this humiliating strategy. Moving into the basement was a Trojan horse. It would place me inside their physical territory. It would grant me unrestricted access to the domestic internet router Elise had used to execute the digital forgery. If I wanted to trace the destination of the stolen $9,000, I needed to hunt from inside the network where the crime originated. I rested my chin against the top of Hazel's warm head, solidifying the plan in the quiet darkness of the recovery ward. Tomorrow morning, I would call Helen. I would manufacture tears. I would play the role of the defeated, desperate sister. I would let them believe they had broken my spirit, completely unaware that they were inviting a forensic investigator into their inner sanctum. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway filtered through the crack under my door, casting long shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. The hospital grew quiet as the midnight shift settled into their routines. The chaotic adrenaline of the afternoon faded, leaving me alone with the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor and the heavy weight of my impending performance. I reached for the plastic cup of tepid water on my tray table, preparing to compose the draft response to Liam's attorney. Before my fingers could brush the rigid plastic, the heavy wooden door to my room clicked. The brass handle turned downward with agonizing slowness. It was past visiting hours. The nursing staff always knocked loudly before entering to announce their presence. This entry was deliberate, stealthy, and completely silent. A slender figure slipped through the narrow opening, quickly pulling the door shut behind them until the latch clicked softly into place. The room was too dim to make out facial features, but the distinct, sharp scent of dark roast coffee and expensive dry cleaning preceded her. The shadow stepped into the weak pool of light cast by the bedside monitoring equipment. It was Maya. My brother Thomas had married her 4 years ago. Maya is a senior corporate compliance officer, a woman whose entire professional existence revolves around identifying institutional corruption and enforcing accountability. She is fiercely intelligent, possessing a gaze that constantly analyzes the hidden motives of everyone in her vicinity. We shared a quiet, unspoken solidarity during family gatherings, silently acknowledging that we were the only two logical women trapped in a house governed by manipulative narcissists. Maya checked the hallway through the small rectangular window in the door, ensuring she had not been followed. She turned back to me, slipping an oversized leather tote bag off her shoulder. She did not offer a warm greeting. She did not ask about my recovery. She pulled a sleek silver burner laptop from the depths of her bag and set it down heavily on the edge of my mattress. "Your sister is bleeding cash, George," Maya whispered, her voice slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. Maya remained poised on the edge of the mattress, her posture conveying the rigid alertness of a soldier navigating a minefield. She kept her voice pitched just above a whisper, ensuring the sound did not penetrate the thin drywall separating my room from the hospital corridor. "Explain," I instructed, matching her low volume. Maya folded her hands over the sleek silver chassis of the laptop. 6 days ago, she began. I received an automated alert from a premier credit monitoring bureau. An unknown party attempted to initiate an unsecured high-yield personal loan utilizing my Social Security number and my maiden name. Because of my security clearance at the firm, my financial files are locked under a dual authentication protocol. The application was flagged and blocked instantly. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, distinct from the physical pain of my recovery. "You traced the origin," I stated. It was not a question. Maya offered a grim, validating nod. I ran a diagnostic trace on the IP address used to submit the fraudulent application. The digital signature originated from the router installed in Helen's living room. Elise tried to steal my credit profile. When my security measures stonewalled her, she grew desperate. She required rapid liquidity, and your sudden medical incapacitation presented a secondary, less secure target. Your landlord was her contingency plan. The sheer audacity of the crime left me momentarily speechless. Elise had not just targeted my savings. She had attempted to cannibalize the financial stability of her own sister-in-law. "I cannot confront Thomas with this yet," Maya continued, her expression hardening into a mask of calculated restraint. "He possesses a pathological blind spot regarding his sister. If I accuse Elise of identity theft without an airtight dossier of empirical evidence, Thomas will default to defending his family, and my marriage will disintegrate over a theoretical dispute. I refuse to wage a war I cannot conclusively win." She slid the unbranded laptop across the rough fabric of the hospital blanket. "This device operates on an encrypted, virtual private network. It will bypass any rudimentary firewalls Elise might have established. I cannot openly dismantle my husband's bloodline, George. But you are the auditor. You possess the skills to map the financial rot. I am giving you the shovel to dig the grave." Maya stood adjusting the strap of her oversized tote bag. She offered a single resolute glance before slipping back out the heavy wooden door, vanishing into the quiet hum of the night shift. I rested my hand on the cool metal casing of the laptop. The path forward was illuminated stark and unforgiving. Dawn crept through the horizontal plastic blinds, casting pale gray light across the sterile linoleum. The bureaucratic machinery of the medical facilities stirred to life. A brisk nursing coordinator arrived holding a clipboard laden with exit-discharge forms. The 48-hour grace period had officially expired. I picked up my phone. The time for pride had passed. Survival required submission. I dialed my mother's phone number. It rang 3 times before Helen answered, her voice crisp and alert, projecting the busy aura of a woman managing a vast social empire. "Mom," I said. I injected a deliberate, wavering tremor into my vocal cords. I let my breathing hitch, simulating the edge of a panic attack. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing a genuine tear of physical exhaustion to spill over my cheek, allowing the raw emotion to color my words. "George," Helen replied, her tone instantly adopting that familiar, patronizing caution. "Are you calming down today?" I have nowhere to go, I whispered, letting a quiet sob fracture the sentence. The hospital is bringing the wheelchair. The locks are changed at my building. Liam sent an email threatening to take the baby. I do not know what to do. Please. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with smug, victorious satisfaction. Helen had anticipated this moment. She had engineered the exact conditions to facilitate my surrender. The rebellious, independent daughter who always refused her help was finally broken, pleading for sanctuary. "Oh, sweetheart," Helen cooed, her voice dripping with manufactured benevolence. "Do not cry. Of course you can come home. We have the guest room, but Elise is currently utilizing the upstairs office space for her remote work, so we will set you up in the finished basement. It is quiet down there. You and the baby can rest without any disturbances. I will send a car service to the patient loading zone immediately." She hung up triumphant. She believed she had secured her ultimate prize. I was no longer a threat. I was a defeated dependent ready to be paraded in front of her country club peers as a tragic charity case. An hour later, a hired black sedan navigated the manicured streets of Helen's exclusive gated community. The neighborhood was a fortress of wealth, characterized by sprawling brick facades, flawless landscaping, and profound isolation. This address was impregnable in a family court. Liam's attorneys could never argue that this zip code constituted an unsafe environment for an infant. Helen stood on the pristine concrete driveway wearing cashmere loungewear. She offered a brief theatrical embrace as the driver retrieved my single overnight bag. She ushered me through the grand foyer, bypassing the sunlit living spaces, and directed me toward the narrow door located beneath the main staircase. The descent into the basement was an exercise in physical agony. Every step sent a sharp, agonizing jolt through my healing pelvis. I cradled Hazel tightly against my chest, navigating the dim, carpeted stairs. The subterranean space smelled faintly of damp earth and old cedar. It was a sprawling, windowless expanse furnished with discarded, outdated furniture from decades past. A small, sagging sofa sat opposite a humming HVAC unit. The chill in the air was immediate, raising goosebumps on my arms. It was a humiliating downgrade, a stark physical representation of my current status within the family hierarchy. I was the overhead relegated to the foundation, while the chosen daughter resided in the sunlight above. Helen lingered on the bottom step just long enough to point out a stack of folded towels. "We will let you sleep," she announced cheerfully. "Let me know if you need any extra blankets. It gets drafty down here." She retreated up the stairs, locking the door at the top. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a loud, metallic thud. I stood in the center of the cold room, listening to the rhythmic hum of the furnace. Overhead, the thick oak floorboards creaked. Footsteps paced back and forth across the main living room. A muffled laugh filtered down through the ceiling joists. It was Elise. She was standing exactly 10 feet above my head, enjoying her morning coffee, entirely oblivious to the threat gestating beneath her feet. The narrative rhythm of my life slowed to a tense, methodical crawl. I was a spy, occupying the enemy camp. Every creak of the floorboards sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. Whenever the heavy door at the top of the stairs unlocked, I had to scramble to shove the silver laptop underneath the sagging sofa cushions. I would throw a blanket over my legs, recline against the cheap upholstery, and feign the exhausted stupor of a shell-shocked victim. Helen descended twice during that first afternoon, bringing a tray of tepid soup and offering unsolicited advice on infant feeding schedules. She sought gratitude, requiring me to perform the role of the subservient guest. I swallowed the thin broth and thanked her profusely, feeding the voracious ego that blinded her to my true motives. When the house finally settled into the quiet stillness of evening, the real work commenced. I retrieved the encrypted device from beneath the sofa. I placed it on a rickety wooden coffee table, angling the screen away from the staircase. I powered the machine on, the faint blue glow illuminating the dark corners of the basement. Because I was physically residing inside the structure, my device detected the local wireless network immediately. Helen had never bothered to update the factory default security settings on her internet router. I bypassed the elementary password protocol in less than 30 seconds, securing a stable, undetected connection. I was now operating inside the exact digital ecosystem Elise had utilized to execute the lease forgery. I launched a background packet sniffer application provided by Maya. The software silently monitors and logs all inbound and outbound traffic coursing through the local network. I did not need to crack passwords or break into secure banking portals. I merely needed to observe the flow of data and identify the anomalies. The screen populated with lines of cascading text, mapping the digital activity occurring throughout the house. I identified Helen's tablet streaming a vintage film in the master suite. I located the smart thermostat, communicating with the local weather grid. Then a third unidentified IP address flickered onto the dashboard. It was a secondary device pinging a remote server located outside the state. The traffic was heavy encrypted and highly irregular for a residential network at 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone on the floor above me was actively moving files. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracking the destination code. The digital footprint did not point toward a hospital billing department or a medical surgical center. The traffic was routing directly to a commercial server bank registered in Delaware. The red herring of the medical procedure vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, alarming truth. Elise was awake, and she was hiding something far more dangerous than a stolen security deposit. I watched the cascading lines of data scroll across the glowing monitor of the burner laptop. The packet sniffer software mapped the digital topography of my mother's house with clinical precision. In the realm of financial forensics, a wireless router is essentially a traffic intersection. It records the origin and the destination of every vehicle passing through, but it cannot see the cargo locked inside the trunk. Elise was actively pinging secure banking portals at 3 in the morning. She was transmitting data to a server farm located in Delaware. The volume of the traffic indicated the transfer of heavy encrypted PDF documents. However, modern banking utilizes advanced, secure socket layer encryption. The specific account numbers, the balances, and the transaction details were hidden behind a cryptographic wall. I possessed the map, but I lacked the key. I leaned back against the sagging upholstery of the basement sofa, frustrated by the limitations of the network scan. To read the payload, I required access to the endpoint. I needed the physical device Elise was using to conduct her midnight transactions. I filtered the network traffic log by media access control addresses, isolating the specific hardware communicating with the offshore servers. The primary device was an encrypted company laptop, likely fortified by the IT department at her marketing firm. Attempting to breach a corporate firewall from a burner computer would trigger an automated security alert, burning my covert position instantly. But as I scrutinized the dashboard, a secondary device flickered into the active registry. It was an Apple tablet. The traffic log indicated it was running a continuous background synchronization protocol. It was pulling mirrored data from a cloud server and caching it locally. I recognized the specific relay address pinging the network. It was connected to a legacy family account created more than a decade ago. Years before seamless family sharing protocols existed, Helen had insisted on maintaining a singular digital calendar to track our high school extracurricular schedules. She forced the entire household to sync our secondary devices to one central email address. Over time, Thomas and I migrated our personal hardware to private accounts. Elise, however, is inherently lazy regarding digital hygiene. She frequently upgrades her primary smartphone, but neglects to update the security protocols on her auxiliary electronics. If she was utilizing her phone to execute the wire fraud, the legacy tablet was silently downloading a perfect duplicate of her browsing history and email cache. I checked the device locator interface. The tablet was drawing a continuous electrical charge, indicating it was plugged into a wall outlet, rather than operating on battery power. Elise was currently working in the upstairs office, but the tablet was registered in the adjacent guest bedroom. She had carelessly left the device on a charger, treating her digital footprint with the same reckless arrogance she applied to our familial relationships. The target was sitting unattended on the second floor. I looked over at the portable bassinet Helen had provided. Hazel was deep in a milk-induced slumber, her chest rising and falling in a steady, unbroken rhythm. I had a narrow, precarious window of opportunity. I pushed myself off the sofa. The physical toll of the delivery immediately asserted itself. A sharp, radiating sting shot through my lower abdomen, forcing me to grip the edge of the coffee table for support. My legs felt hollow and unsteady. The medical staff had instructed me to avoid stairs entirely for the first week of recovery. I ignored the medical directive, focusing my mind on the objective. Pain is a temporary biological signal. The threat of losing my daughter was a permanent structural flaw. I approached the narrow wooden staircase leading up to the main floor. The house was consumed by profound silence, the kind of quiet that amplifies the sound of a beating heart. I placed my right foot on the bottom tread, shifting my weight with agonizing slowness. The old oak floorboards groaned softly under the pressure. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any shift in the air currents above. Nothing stirred. I navigated the ascent one agonizing step at a time. I kept my weight distributed near the edges of the staircase, where the wood is most structurally sound and least likely to squeak. By the time I reached the landing, a cold sweat coated my forehead. The dim glow of a recessed nightlight illuminated the sprawling foyer. I crept down the carpeted hallway toward the guest bedroom. The door was ajar, allowing a sliver of pale moonlight to cut across the pristine carpet. I pushed the door open, wincing as the brass hinges let out a faint metallic whine. The room smelled of aerosol dusting spray and stale potpourri. Helen maintained this space as a sterile showroom, forbidding anyone from actually sleeping in the staged decorative bedding. Sitting on the polished mahogany nightstand tethered to a white charging cable was the silver tablet. I crossed the room and picked up the device. The screen illuminated immediately, bathing my face in a harsh blue glare. A passcode prompt appeared. Elise had never possessed a talent for complex security measures. She relied on predictability. I entered Helen's birth year, followed by the day and month. The screen unlocked. I muted the volume instantly and lowered the brightness setting to its minimum threshold. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the illuminated screen serving as a portal into my sister's hidden reality. I bypassed her social media applications and navigated directly to the native web browser. I opened the historical archive. The chronology of her panic was laid bare in the search queries. 6 days ago, the timeline displayed a frantic series of searches regarding unsecured personal loans and credit checks corroborating Maya's report of the thwarted identity theft. 3 days ago, the search parameters shifted to lease termination penalties and digital signature software. She had mapped the eviction strategy with chilling premeditation. I opened the cached downloads folder. The first document was a high-resolution PDF. I tapped the icon. It was the official wire transfer confirmation generated by Richard Sterling's property management portal. The receipt detailed the deduction of the $2,000 expedition fee. The remaining balance of $7,200 was routed to a recipient listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. Apex Holdings was the entity registered in Delaware. It was a classic shell company structure designed to obscure the identity of the primary beneficiary. People do not utilize anonymous corporate entities to pay for hospital surgical copays. I closed the browser and opened the default mail application. The inbox was cluttered with promotional retail spam, but I utilized the search function, typing the word Apex. A single extensive email thread populated the screen. The correspondence stretched back over 14 months. I opened the oldest message in the chain. The sender utilized a secure encrypted email service, shielding their actual name behind a numerical alias. I read the text, feeling the ambient temperature of the room plummet. The emails were not invoices. They were demands. The early messages documented a covert financial arrangement. Elise had been funneling proprietary marketing analytics and client acquisition data from her corporate employer directly to this anonymous third party. She was committing corporate espionage, selling her firm's trade secrets for supplementary income. The Delaware LLC was the vehicle used to launder her illicit payments. However, the tone of the correspondence shifted drastically 3 weeks ago. I scrolled to the most recent exchanges. The anonymous buyer had discovered a discrepancy in the data Elise provided. She had grown sloppy, delivering falsified metrics that exposed the buyer to a significant financial loss. The buyer was no longer paying her. They were blackmailing her. The final email in the thread, timestamped the morning of my hospital admission, was stark and unyielding. "You missed the deadline," the message read. "The deficit is $7,000. Transfer the funds to the Apex account by Friday evening. If the wire does not clear, I will forward the unredacted proof of your data theft directly to your compliance officer. You will face federal prosecution, and I will ensure your brother sees the surveillance photographs." I stopped breathing. I reread the final sentence. The threat regarding federal prosecution was severe, but the mention of my brother elevated the blackmail to an entirely different arena. Why would an anonymous corporate data buyer threaten to expose a lease to Thomas? Thomas worked in logistics, not marketing. He had zero connection to her professional sector, unless the buyer was not a stranger. I zoomed in on the attached file at the bottom of the email. It was a compressed image folder labeled as leverage. I tapped the screen, authorizing the download. The images rendered in sharp, undeniable clarity. They were time-stamped security photographs taken outside a luxury hotel in downtown Indianapolis. The pictures captured Elise embracing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. The physical intimacy depicted in the frame was undeniable. I recognized the man instantly. The pieces of the labyrinth aligned, forming a picture so devastating it threatened to stop my heart. The anonymous buyer, the operator of Apex Holdings, and the man sharing a hotel room with my sister were the exact same person. It was Marcus. Thomas had built his logistics firm from the ground up alongside Marcus. They were best friends, equal shareholders, and trusted confidants. Elise had not just stolen my home. She was carrying on a prolonged, illicit affair with our brother's business partner, while simultaneously embezzling corporate data to fund her lifestyle. When Marcus realized she was defrauding him too, he leveraged their affair and her corporate theft to extort the money back. Elise stole my security deposit to pay off her extortionist lover and bury her treason. I stared at the photograph, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The narrative of the frail, supportive sister dissolved into ash. I held the absolute destruction of my family in the palm of my hand. Before I could formulate my next tactical maneuver, the heavy tread of footsteps sounded in the hallway just outside the bedroom door. The heavy tread of footsteps vibrated through the floorboards just outside the guest bedroom door. The ambient light bleeding beneath the doorframe fractured as a shadow eclipsed the threshold. I had a fraction of a second to react. I tapped the power button on the silver tablet, extinguishing the harsh blue glare, and placed the device precisely back onto its magnetic charging dock. I dropped to the carpet, pressing my spine flush against the side of the heavy mahogany nightstand. My shoulder blades dug into the carved wood. I forced my breathing into a shallow, silent rhythm, feeling the erratic, heavy thud of my own pulse against my ribs. The brass door handle turned downward. The hinges let out a faint metallic groan. The scent of vanilla perfume and stale red wine drifted into the stagnant air of the room. It was Elise. Her bare feet slapped softly against the plush carpet. She was muttering under her breath a low, frustrated cadence. She opened a dresser drawer on the opposite side of the room. The rustle of fabric echoed in the dark. She slammed the drawer shut. She took 2 steps toward the nightstand. She stood inches from my hidden position. The fabric of her silk robe brushed the edge of the nightstand. If she looked down, she would see the edge of my hospital grip socks. She would see her discarded sister, crouched in the shadows, holding the digital keys to her ruin. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of her uneven breathing. She reached across the surface of the wood, her hand brushing the charging cable. She grabbed a different electronic device, a smartwatch she had left behind earlier in the day. She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The latch clicked securely into place. The shadow beneath the doorframe retreated down the carpeted hall. I released the breath I was holding, the oxygen burning my lungs. I remained on the floor for 2 full minutes, ensuring her footsteps faded completely into the master suite at the far end of the corridor. I rose from the carpet. I could not rely on accessing this hardware a second time. Elise might notice the tablet was unlocked or decide to pack it into her work bag the following morning. I pulled my personal cellular phone from my pocket. I unlocked the tablet once more, bypassing the screen brightness lock, and opened the camera application on my phone. I systematically photographed the glowing screen. I captured every individual email in the extortion thread. I documented the timestamps, the routing numbers for the Delaware Shell Company, and the high-resolution surveillance images of Elise and Marcus outside the downtown hotel. I built an encrypted local vault on my device and transferred the images into the secure folder. The evidence was preserved. I navigated the wooden staircase back to the subterranean chill of the basement. The descent was agonizing, my physical reserves nearly depleted, but the adrenaline surging through my nervous system kept me upright. Hazel was still sleeping soundly in the portable bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful cadence. I sat heavily on the sagging sofa and stared at the concrete wall. The adrenaline slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. The magnitude of the intelligence I had just acquired fundamentally altered the geometry of the battlefield. The red herring of my mother's surgical procedure was officially dead. Elise did not act out of a misplaced sense of familial duty. She acted out of primal self-preservation. She had engaged in a prolonged, reckless liaison with a man who destroys competitors for sport. Marcus is a venture capital architect. Thomas brought him into the family inner circle 5 years ago to celebrate the initial public offering of their logistics firm. Marcus is brilliant, charming, and entirely devoid of a moral compass. He views personal relationships as liquid assets to be leveraged and discarded when they no longer yield a favorable return. Elise saw Marcus as a status symbol. She assumed her conventional attractiveness and manipulative charm would allow her to control a man who operates on pure predatory instinct. She was tragically mistaken. Elise, playing the role of a corporate spy, perfectly illustrated her profound arrogance. She attempted to steal proprietary marketing algorithms from her employer to sell to a rival firm, utilizing Marcus and his anonymous corporate entities to launder the illicit payments. When Marcus discovered her data was flawed, exposing his investments to significant risk, his retaliation was swift and merciless. The extortion was his method of discipline. He demanded $9,200 as restitution, holding her career and her family standing hostage. Elise stole my security deposit to pay off her extortionist lover and bury her treason. The revelation transformed the narrative. This was no longer a petty domestic dispute over a broken residential lease. This was documented corporate fraud, identity theft, and criminal blackmail. I held the detonator to Elise's social and professional existence. My initial instinct was to march up the stairs, awaken Thomas, and hand him the photographic evidence. The urge to expose the betrayal to the brother who had so casually handed me a stack of hush money was overwhelming. Elise was sleeping with his trusted business partner. The revelation would shatter his pristine, curated life. But my analytical training intervened, forcing me to evaluate the probable outcome of that scenario. Thomas is a pragmatist who prioritizes optics over ethics. If I reveal this dossier to him, he faces a catastrophic dilemma. He can confront Marcus, potentially fracturing his company, dissolving his equity, and destroying his imminent promotion to senior partner, or he can bury the scandal to protect his wealth. Based on his willingness to drop an envelope of cash on my hospital tray to avoid a public inconvenience, Thomas would inevitably choose the cover-up. He would view my evidence not as a vindication of my character, but as a direct threat to his corporate stability. If I told Thomas, he would not defend me. He would align with Marcus and Elise to neutralize me permanently. He would use his substantial financial resources to ensure I lost my daughter, simply to keep his logistics firm intact. I could not rely on family loyalty. Family loyalty is a myth that made me homeless. I must utilize this intelligence as leverage. I could not fire the weapon yet. I needed to position the targets in a confined space where escape was impossible and where the audience would prevent Thomas from burying the truth. I needed a public execution. The power dynamic had officially inverted. I was no longer the helpless, erratic victim hiding in the damp foundation of my mother's house. I was the apex predator in this ecosystem, and I was armed with verifiable data. I connected my phone to the silver burner laptop Maya had provided. I uploaded the photographs to the encrypted hard drive. I initiated an optical character recognition scan to convert the images into searchable text files, preparing the data for a comprehensive audit. I needed to map the exact timeline of the extortion to ensure there were no hidden variables. As I cross-referenced the data points reading the harsh demands Marcus had typed, I noticed a subtle discrepancy in the email headers. When Marcus issued his final threat, the one demanding the cash by Friday evening, he included the surveillance photograph as an attachment. I opened the Properties tab of the attached image file, inspecting the raw metadata hidden beneath the visual layer. The metadata reveals the digital fingerprint of the original file creator. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The author of the surveillance photograph was not Marcus. The image had been captured and processed by a third-party entity before being transferred to the Delaware Shell Company. The original file creator was listed as a private investigative firm. I recognized the specific corporate domain associated with that firm. It was a subsidiary contractor frequently employed by a high-profile political consulting agency in Indianapolis. It was the exact political consulting agency currently managing the municipal campaign for my former fiancé, Liam. The digital fingerprint buried within the metadata of the surveillance photograph illuminated the screen of the burner laptop. In the realm of cybersecurity, an exchangeable image file format provides the invisible scaffolding supporting every captured picture. It logs the date, the exposure, settings, the geolocation coordinates, and, most importantly, the registered owner of the recording hardware. The creator tag attached to the image of Elise and Marcus standing outside the downtown hotel did not belong to a jealous spouse or a random bystander. The registered proprietor was Vanguard Intelligence. Vanguard Intelligence is a boutique private investigation firm operating out of a discreet office park in suburban Indianapolis. They do not handle routine domestic disputes or insurance fraud cases. They cater exclusively to corporate conglomerates and high-net-worth political action committees. They specialize in opposition research, conducting deep background audits to neutralize potential liabilities before a candidate announces a public campaign. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, the chill of the basement, forgotten as a profound, chilling clarity washed over my senses. 6 months ago, Liam officially formed his exploratory committee for the upcoming municipal election. His prominent family had spent decades grooming him for a seat on the city council, laying the groundwork for a future mayoral run. The timing of the Vanguard surveillance aligned perfectly with the launch of his political apparatus. When I severed our engagement, citing his chronic infidelity and emotional detachment, I transitioned from a compliant future wife to a volatile, unpredictable variable. Liam does not tolerate variables. He mitigates risk. He required absolute control over his biological heir to ensure his public image remained pristine. He could not merely file a standard custody petition because I possessed a stable career, a clean record, and a secure residence. He needed to manufacture a catastrophic failure on my part to justify an emergency judicial intervention. He hired Vanguard to map my ecosystem, searching for a vulnerability he could exploit. They audited my family. They shadowed my relatives, analyzing their habits, their finances, and their hidden vices. It did not take the operatives long to uncover Elise's reckless corporate espionage and her illicit hotel rendezvous with our brother's primary business partner. But Liam did not leak the compromising photographs to the local press. He did not confront Thomas with the evidence of his partner's betrayal. A direct assault would expose Liam's involvement, tarnishing his curated reputation with the messy stain of a family scandal. Liam operates with the sterile detachment of a chess grandmaster. He utilized a proxy. He packaged the Vanguard intelligence report and forwarded it anonymously to Marcus. The sinister brilliance of the maneuver sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Liam understood the psychological architecture of my family better than I did. He anticipated the precise chain reaction his anonymous delivery would trigger. He knew Marcus operated as a predatory venture capitalist, a man who would interpret Elise's data theft not merely as a breach of trust, but as a financial deficit requiring immediate punitive restitution. Liam knew Marcus would extort Elise. Furthermore, Liam possessed a flawless psychological profile of my sister. He knew Elise operated on sheer narcissism and self-preservation. Confronted with the threat of federal prosecution and the destruction of her social standing, she would not confess her sins to Thomas. She would seek the path of least resistance to acquire the extortion funds. Liam knew she possessed the legacy login credentials for my tenant portal. He squeezed the vice around her neck, knowing she would panic forge my digital signature and siphon my life savings to satisfy the blackmailer. By feeding the intelligence to Marcus, Liam transformed my own sister into a guided missile aimed directly at my housing stability. Elise executing the illegal eviction was the catalyst Liam required. The moment I lost my apartment, I became a transient. The moment I became a transient, I fit the legal definition of an unfit homeless mother. Liam orchestrated the entire sequence of events from the shadows, maintaining plausible deniability while my world collapsed. I traced the overlapping vectors of the trail on the screen, mapping the intricate web designed to annihilate my independence. I was not engaged in a linear skirmish against a single greedy relative. I was battling a synchronized ecosystem of destruction. Every participant played a specific, vital role in my subjugation. Richard Sterling, the property manager, functioned as the corrupt gatekeeper, blinded by a cheap bribe and a disregard for tenant law. Elise served as the desperate executioner, drowning in the consequences of her own infidelity and corporate theft. Helen operated as the chief propagandist, utilizing her country club influence to seed the narrative of my emotional fragility, gaslighting the community into believing I was unstable. Thomas provided the financial cover-up, tossing an envelope of hush money onto my hospital tray to protect his fragile ego and his logistics firm. Sitting at the apex of this toxic hierarchy was Liam, the architect. He manipulated their innate greed, their vanity, and their cowardice, plucking the strings to ensure I was stripped of my assets, my home, and ultimately, my child. I looked over at Hazel. The portable bassinet cast a long, trembling shadow against the concrete wall. She shifted in her sleep, letting out a soft, contented sigh. She shared Liam's DNA, but she possessed none of his malice. She was innocent, a fragile life caught in the crossfire of a political ambition. The thought of handing her over to a man who engineered the ruin of her mother simply to secure a favorable polling demographic ignited a slow, steady burn in my chest. I closed the lid of the silver burner laptop. The screen went dark, plunging the basement back into shadows. My hands rested on the metal casing. They were remarkably steady. The realization that my entire support network had actively colluded to destroy me should have induced a paralytic panic. Instead, the truth cauterized the wound. The lingering threads of familial obligation, the persistent hope that my mother or my siblings harbored some fundamental shred of decency, evaporated entirely. I was liberated from the burden of their expectations. I was no longer the discarded daughter weeping in a damp cellar. I was a structural engineer examining a faulty bridge, calculating the exact explosive yield required to bring the entire edifice crashing down into the river. To dismantle an ecosystem, you do not attack the apex predator first. You target the weakest structural support. If you remove the foundation, the apex plummets. Liam believed his proxy strategy insulated him from the fallout. He assumed his high-priced defense attorneys could dismiss the digital metadata as circumstantial evidence, arguing the IP logs were easily spoofed by malicious actors. Elise would deny the affair, Thomas would bury the embezzlement, and Helen would testify to my erratic behavior under oath. They would present a united, impenetrable front in a family court hearing. I needed physical, undeniable proof that connected the illicit eviction to the broader conspiracy. I needed a verified confession from the outside world, a document that could not be dismissed as a hormonal hallucination or a digital anomaly. The weakest link in their synchronized machinery was not the political candidate. It was not the predatory venture capitalist. It was the greedy, short-sighted landlord who accepted a kickback on a Friday afternoon. Richard Sterling operated a mid-tier property management portfolio. He relied on maintaining a valid real estate broker's license to sustain his livelihood. He was driven by immediate cash flow, prioritizing quick tenant turnovers over regulatory compliance. Unlike Liam or Marcus Sterling, did not possess generational wealth or a phalanx of corporate litigators to shield him from the consequences of wire fraud. If confronted with the reality of a federal indictment, Sterling would crumble. He would trade his accomplices for a plea deal without hesitation. I reached into the pocket of my maternity trousers. My fingers brushed the thick, crisp paper of the white envelope Thomas had delivered. The hush money. Tomas intended for this currency to fund a quiet disappearance into a transient motel. He provided the exact liquid capital I required to execute the next phase of the audit. I needed to convert his paper currency into a written admission of guilt. I could not interrogate Sterling over the telephone a second time. The element of surprise had vanished. I needed to infiltrate his property management office, bypass his defensive posturing, and extract the internal communication logs documenting the illegal transaction. I glanced at the narrow staircase leading up to the main floor. The morning sun would soon crest the horizon, signaling the start of the business day. I had to navigate the physical pain of my recovery leave, the fortified perimeter of my mother's house, and secure the final piece of ammunition before Liam's emergency custody petition hit the judicial docket on Monday morning. The timeline was unforgiving, but the path was clear. The morning sun pierced the narrow basement egress window, casting a rectangular block of pale light onto the concrete floor. I listened to the sounds of the house waking up above me. Helen retreated to her master suite, preparing for her mid-morning tennis clinic. Her luxury vehicle engine rumbled to life, the vibrations transferring down through the foundation, followed by the mechanical hum of the garage door closing. Soon after, the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard echoed through the ceiling joists. Elise had commenced her remote workday, securely stationed in the upstairs home office. The perimeter was clear. The timing was optimal. I carefully lifted Hazel from her portable bassinet, transferring her small weight into a rigid plastic infant carrier. My pelvic bones protested the sudden shift in equilibrium, sending a sharp, radiating sting down my thighs. I gritted my teeth, breathing through the physical penalty of my recent labor. Survival demands ignoring the biological warnings. I draped a breathable cotton swaddle over the carrier handle, shielding my sleeping daughter from the harsh elements, and retrieved the thick white envelope from the rickety coffee table. The 10 crisp $100 bills rested securely inside. Thomas provided this currency to facilitate a quiet surrender. He assumed I would purchase a temporary motel room, fading silently into the socio-economic background, while his business partner dismantled my life. The irony tasted metallic and sharp on my tongue. My brother had inadvertently financed his own sister's impending prosecution. I bypassed the main living areas, utilizing the side utility door to exit the property. The humid Indiana summer air enveloped me instantly, a suffocating blanket of moisture and heat. A rideshare vehicle waited at the curb, requested, utilizing a prepaid digital gift card, to obscure the geographical waypoint from any potential network monitoring. I secured the infant carrier into the back seat and provided the driver with a commercial address located on the north side of Indianapolis. Sterling Property Management occupied a drab, single-story brick building situated at the neglected end of a fading strip mall. The exterior aesthetic perfectly mirrored the ethical standards of the proprietor. Faded vinyl lettering peeled away from the plate glass windows, obscuring a chaotic interior of overflowing filing cabinets and cheap laminate desks. I asked the driver to wait, promising a substantial cash tip upon my return. I grasped the handle of the infant carrier and pushed through the heavy glass door. A small brass bell chimed overhead, announcing my arrival into a room that smelled heavily of burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. The front reception area was isolated from the inner executive suites by a frosted glass partition. A solitary employee occupied the front desk. She was a woman in her late 40s, displaying the weary, hollow expression of an individual subjected to years of inadequate compensation and chronic disrespect. Her nameplate read, Brenda. Brenda did not look up from her dual monitors. She continued clicking her mouse with aggressive, rhythmic precision. A cheap plastic fan oscillated on the corner of her desk, merely circulating the warm, stagnant air. I approached the high counter. As a data auditor, interpreting human behavior is just as critical as analyzing a spreadsheet. Disgruntled employees represent the most vulnerable access point within any corporate security infrastructure. Brenda exhibited every classic indicator of a marginalized worker. Her cuticles were bitten raw. Her posture slumped under the invisible weight of a hostile management structure. She harbored zero loyalty to Richard Sterling. "Can I help you?" Brenda asked, her tone flat and devoid of customer service polish. She finally dragged her gaze away from the screen, her eyes settling briefly on the infant carrier before meeting mine. "I need a copy of a specific internal document," I replied, keeping my voice low and conversational. "It pertains to a residential lease termination processed yesterday afternoon, Unit 304. Brenda let out a short, cynical breath, reaching for a stack of blank intake forms. "You need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Sterling for any lease disputes. He is currently conducting a conference call in his office. I cannot process document requests without his authorization." I placed my hand on the counter. The muffled, booming cadence of Sterling's voice filtered through the frosted glass behind her. He was laughing, the arrogant, unrestricted sound of a man who believed he held total dominance over his domain. The proximity to the architect of my eviction triggered a spike of adrenaline, but I maintained a stoic exterior. "I am not here to dispute the lease," I stated softly. "I am conducting an independent compliance review regarding the transaction protocol. I simply require the internal communication log attached to that specific tenant file. The text messages exchanged between the property manager and the representative who finalized the vacancy." Brenda stopped moving. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing as she processed the unusual terminology. "Ma'am, that is internal proprietary data. I am not authorized to print back-end system communications for a former tenant. Please leave before I call security." I reached into the pocket of my maternity trousers. I withdrew the crisp $100 bills Thomas had provided. I slid 3 of the notes across the scratched laminate surface, resting my index finger on the portrait of Benjamin Franklin. "I am aware of your corporate policies, Brenda," I said, maintaining steady, unblinking eye contact. "I am also aware that Richard Sterling likely pays you a fraction of what you actually deserve to manage his operational chaos. Printing a single page of text logs requires 3 keystrokes and 10 seconds of your time." Brenda looked at the currency. $300 represented a significant percentage of a weekly clerical salary. Her breathing changed, becoming shallow and rapid. She glanced nervously toward the frosted glass door separating her from her employer. Sterling's voice continued to drone on, completely absorbed in his phone call. I slid 2 additional bills across the counter, bringing the total to $500. The visual impact of the green ink against the white laminate was striking. 5 keystrokes, I murmured. 5 seconds. And you have a financial buffer he will never know about. The moral calculus played out across her weary features in real time. Loyalty to a corrupt slumlord holds 0 intrinsic value when weighed against tangible currency. Brenda reached out with a lightning-fast motion, sweeping the 5 crisp bills off the counter and depositing them directly into her handbag resting on the floor. She turned back to her dual monitors. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced efficiency. The laser printer situated at the end of the counter whirred to life, the internal rollers engaging with a loud, grinding hum. The noise seemed deafening in the quiet reception area. My heart hammered against my ribs. If Sterling finished his conference call and opened that glass door, the entire operation would collapse. He would confiscate the document, summon law enforcement, and I would be arrested for trespassing and corporate bribery, handing Liam the final nail for my custody coffin. The printer expelled a single sheet of warm white paper into the output tray. Brenda snatched the document and slid it across the counter, face down. "You're never here," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the residual adrenaline of the illicit transaction. I secured the paper, folded it precisely in half, and tucked it into my pocket alongside the remaining $500. "Have a wonderful morning," I replied. I lifted the infant carrier and exited the building, the brass bell chiming a final, cheerful farewell. I climbed back into the waiting rideshare vehicle, locking the door behind me. I instructed the driver to return to the gated community, waiting until we merged onto the main thoroughfare before retrieving the folded document. I opened the paper, my eyes scanning the printed text. The page contained a raw export of the integrated messaging system Sterling utilized to communicate with prospective tenants and property stakeholders. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the events of the previous afternoon. I located the specific exchange between Sterling and the cellular number registered to a lease. The first message from my sister read, "The tenant is hospitalized. We need to expedite the vacancy today to free up the liquid capital. I have her login credentials. Will you accept a digital signature?" Sterling's response was printed in stark, undeniable black and white. "I know the signature is not hers," the message read. "The liability is too high for a standard break. But if the sister pays a premium, I will process the digital form and bypass the walkthrough today. Keep the final month rent and deduct $2,000 for my trouble." A profound, chilling satisfaction settled into my bones. The puzzle was complete. I held a written, authenticated admission of conspiracy and wire fraud. Richard Sterling explicitly acknowledged the fraudulent nature of the document and actively negotiated a financial kickback to facilitate the crime. Thomas had attempted to purchase my silence. Instead, his money had purchased the exact forensic ammunition required to obliterate the entire syndicate. I folded the paper and returned it to my pocket. The evidentiary phase of my audit was officially concluded. I possessed the router logs, the extortion emails, the Vanguard surveillance photographs, and the landlord confession. I held the digital blueprint of an ecosystem designed to destroy me. However, raw data is useless without a mechanism for deployment. An auditor identifies the fraud, but a litigator enforces the penalty. I could not walk into a family court on Monday morning and present this complex web of corporate blackmail and political sabotage without professional translation. A judge would view a pro se defendant waving printed text messages as the erratic, desperate woman Liam claimed me to be. I needed a legal predator. I needed a professional who could weaponize this intelligence, draft the civil complaints, and build an impenetrable defensive perimeter around my daughter before the weekend expired. I pulled my phone from my pocket and composed a secure, encrypted message to Maya. I needed her to leverage her corporate compliance network. The clock was accelerating, and the final strike required a sniper. The afternoon heat radiated through the narrow basement window by the time I returned to the secure perimeter of my mother's house. The physical exertion of navigating the city days after childbirth left my body trembling, a dull ache throbbing deep within my pelvis. I transferred Hazel back into her portable bassinet, watching her chest rise and fall in a peaceful rhythm. I retrieved the folded paper from my pocket, smoothing the creases over the surface of the rickety wooden coffee table. The printed communication log from Richard Sterling's office sat next to the silver burner laptop, completing the forensic chain of custody. I opened the encrypted messaging application and contacted Maya. I provided a concise summary of the morning acquisition. Maya responded within 3 minutes, sending a secure video conference link and a single name, Evelyn Thorne. Maya explained that Evelyn was a senior partner at a boutique litigation firm located in downtown Indianapolis. She was a former state prosecutor who had transitioned into aggressive civil litigation, specializing in corporate malfeasance and contract disputes. Evelyn did not build defensive perimeters for her clients. She specialized in structural demolition. She was the exact predator I required to translate my raw data into actionable judicial consequences. At exactly 1 o'clock, I propped the laptop on a stack of discarded encyclopedias and initiated the secure video call. Evelyn Thorne appeared on the monitor. She sat in a pristine glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate knot. Her expression held the clinical, calculating detachment of a surgeon evaluating a terminal diagnosis. Maya had briefed her on the fundamental parameters of the situation, but I provided the empirical evidence. I shared my screen, guiding Evelyn through the audit. I presented the forged DocuSign, time-stamped against my medical delivery chart. I traced the digital footprint from the basement router to the Delaware shell company. I displayed the extortion emails detailing Elise's corporate espionage and her affair with Marcus. I highlighted the Vanguard intelligence metadata, linking Liam to the blackmail scheme. Finally, I exhibited the text message where Sterling explicitly admitted to accepting a financial kickback to authorize the fraudulent eviction. Evelyn Thorne listened in unbroken silence. She did not offer hollow sympathies regarding my postpartum state or express shock at the depth of the familial betrayal. She evaluated the intelligence with the sharp, appreciative focus of an artillery commander handed the exact coordinates of an enemy stronghold. Most clients bring me emotional grievances and expect me to manufacture a legal remedy, Evelyn stated, her voice crisp and resonant through the small laptop speakers. You have brought me a turnkey execution, George. We are not going to mount a defense against your former fiancé or your landlord. We are going to initiate a scorched earth offensive that threatens their respective livelihoods. Evelyn opened a fresh digital workspace and began drafting the legal architecture of my retribution while we spoke. Our first target was the landlord. Evelyn explained that filing a standard civil suit for a broken lease would take months to navigate the crowded Indiana court dockets. Sterling would rely on his corporate insurance to delay the proceedings. Instead, Evelyn drafted a severe pre-litigation demand notice. The document served as a formal declaration of intent to report Sterling directly to the Indiana Real Estate Commission and the state attorney general. The demand notice cited the specific statutes Sterling violated by accepting an undocumented marketing fee to bypass the mandatory security deposit waiting period. Evelyn attached a draft of a federal complaint for wire fraud utilizing his printed text messages as undeniable proof of his conspiracy. Once his corporate counsel reviews this demand, Evelyn murmured, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. They will realize his broker license is in immediate, fatal jeopardy. A state investigation will freeze his operating trust accounts across his entire property portfolio. He will face a binary choice between surrendering his ill-gotten assets to you or spending a decade defending himself against federal prosecutors. He will capitulate instantly. We pivoted to Elise. The familial connection often complicates criminal referrals involving financial disputes, as law enforcement tends to dismiss them as domestic misunderstandings. Evelyn eradicated that defense by drafting a comprehensive criminal referral package. The documentation detailed felony identity theft, unauthorized access to a computer network, and bank fraud. Maya joined the conference call during her designated lunch hour, calling from a secure line within her corporate office. She provided Evelyn with the specific internal compliance codes Elise had violated by embezzling the proprietary marketing algorithms from her employer. Evelyn seamlessly integrated the data theft into the criminal referral, linking the corporate espionage directly to the extortion payments sent to Marcus. The resulting police report was a meticulous, irrefutable timeline of a felony. Elise would not face a lecture from a sympathetic detective. She would face an arrest warrant. The final and most critical component of the legal strike addressed Liam. Evelyn accessed the Marion County Family Court database. Liam's prominent attorney had filed the emergency custody petition early Friday morning. The filing utilized my sudden residential eviction and my alleged erratic behavior as the primary justification for declaring me an unfit parent. Evelyn drafted a blistering answer and counterclaim that transformed his offensive maneuver into a definitive legal liability. She attached the Vanguard intelligence metadata analysis. The legal response explicitly outlined how Liam colluded with a predatory venture capitalist to financially extort my sister. The document alleged that Liam intentionally engineered my homelessness to manufacture the exact crisis he was now citing in his custody petition. This behavior constitutes malicious prosecution and a profound abuse of judicial process. Evelyn explained, her tone devoid of any warmth. If Liam pursues this custody hearing, I will subpoena the Vanguard operatives. I will depose his political campaign managers on the public record. I will drag his pristine public image through a prolonged, brutal discovery phase in open court. A man running on a family values platform cannot survive a documented conspiracy to render his own infant daughter homeless. He will withdraw the petition before the magistrate even reviews the docket. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the legal arsenal was fully assembled. Evelyn finalized the drafts, ensuring every citation and exhibit was perfectly aligned. Maya arrived at the house shortly after 6, operating under the guise of delivering postpartum supplies. Helen welcomed her warmly at the front door, thrilled by the visit, and entirely oblivious to the contraband hidden within Maya's designer tote bag. Maya descended the narrow basement stairs, her heels clicking softly against the wood. She reached the bottom step and handed me a thick, black leather presentation folder. I rested the folder on my lap. It contained physical copies of every document Evelyn had drafted, printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper. The pages were organized with clinical precision, tabbed and indexed for immediate deployment. I ran my hand over the smooth leather cover, feeling the immense weight of the intelligence contained within. This folder represented the permanent reversal of power. The paper inside held the capacity to strip a corrupt landlord of his livelihood, send a manipulative sister to a state penitentiary, and end a promising political career before it ever reached a ballot. The documents were my Chekhov's gun. Every piece of evidence had a specific purpose, and the weapon was now fully loaded and chambered. I looked up at Maya. We shared a silent, resolute nod. The audit was complete. I was merely waiting for the correct stage to pull the trigger. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs creaked open, breaking the quiet tension of the basement. Helen's footsteps descended toward us. She carried a silver tray holding a single plate of catered food and a glass of ice water. She surveyed the dim concrete space with a look of profound, self-satisfied validation. She believed she was looking at a broken, dependent daughter and a sympathetic sister-in-law. I slid the leather folder beneath a folded fleece blanket just before she reached the bottom step. "Tomorrow is Sunday, George," Helen announced, her tone bright, commanding, and utterly devoid of genuine empathy. "I have decided to host a welcome home brunch for the baby." I kept my hands resting flat on the blanket, concealing the weapon beneath my palms. "It will be nothing formal," Helen continued, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Just 20 or 30 of our closest friends, the country club board members, and a few neighbors. I want everyone to see how well we are taking care of you during this difficult transition. Liam is even stopping by to show his support. You should try to find something presentable to wear. We need to demonstrate that this family remains united, despite your recent setbacks." The audacity of her proposition crystallized the narrative. Helen desired an audience. She intended to parade her displaced daughter in front of the Indianapolis elite to solidify her fabricated story of benevolence and grace. She was inviting the very people she had gossiped with, constructing a social amphitheater to celebrate my subjugation. She was building the exact public forum I required to execute the legal strike. I looked up at my mother, maintaining my carefully constructed facade of weary, hollow defeat. I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the obedient, grateful charity case she so desperately needed me to be. "I will be there, Mom," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and compliant. I would not miss it for the world. The Sunday morning light filtered weakly through the narrow basement egress window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I stood before a cheap, warped vanity mirror Helen had discarded decades ago. The reflection staring back belonged to a woman teetering on the edge of physical collapse. Dark, bruised shadows underscored my eyes. My complexion carried a pale, exhausted pallor. My hair hung in unwashed, loose strands around my face. I did not attempt to conceal these flaws. I cultivated them. I selected a slate gray maternity tunic from my limited overnight bag. The fabric was wrinkled and fit poorly hanging off my recovering frame, with a deliberate, sloppy aesthetic. I paired it with standard black leggings and scuffed flat shoes. The objective was to embody the precise visual archetype my mother desired. I needed to look destitute. I needed to appear defeated, a broken, dependent, relying entirely on the charity of her affluent relatives. I turned my attention to the portable bassinet. Hazel had just finished nursing, her small face relaxed in a milk-drunk slumber. I swaddled her tightly in a faded receiving blanket. Beside the bassinet sat my oversized canvas diaper bag. I emptied a compartment typically reserved for changing pads and wet wipes. I retrieved the sleek black leather presentation folder Maya had delivered the previous evening. The folder contained the verified landlord confession, the Vanguard intelligence metadata, the extortion emails, the State Real Estate Commission demand notices, and the drafted criminal referrals. I slid the heavy leather binding into the canvas partition, concealing the legal demolition charge, beneath a layer of burp cloths and extra pacifiers. The muffled sound of polite conversation and clinking glassware drifted down through the ceiling joists. The welcome home brunch was underway. I gathered my daughter into my arms, slung the heavy canvas bag over my right shoulder, and approached the wooden staircase. Every step upward required a conscious, agonizing effort, my pelvic joints protesting the vertical climb. I regulated my breathing, pushing the biological discomfort aside. The pain was irrelevant. The mission was paramount. I pushed open the door leading to the main foyer. The contrast between the dim, silent cellar and the vibrant, chaotic main floor was jarring. Helen had transformed her sprawling vaulted living room into a theatrical set designed for maximum social impact. Morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating expensive Persian rugs and pristine ivory furniture. A catered buffet spanned the length of the formal dining table, offering artisanal quiches, smoked salmon, and fresh pastries. A hired bartender stood near the mahogany study doors, pouring mimosas into tall crystal flutes. The room held at least 30 guests. I recognized prominent members of the local country club board, a few wealthy neighbors, and several spouses of regional politicians. They wore pastel linen-pressed slacks and designer sundresses, their outfits projecting casual, effortless prosperity. As I stepped onto the polished hardwood floor, the ambient chatter nearest the hallway faltered. A ripple of sudden awkward silence spread across the room as the guests registered my presence. Eyes darted toward my wrinkled tunic, the dark circles under my eyes, and the canvas bag slung over my shoulder. I saw pity. I saw morbid curiosity. I saw the distinct, uncomfortable condescension reserved for tragedies occurring outside their tax bracket. Helen materialized from the crowd almost instantly. She wore a tailored peach sheath dress, her neck adorned with a strand of authentic pearls. Her face broke into a mask of exaggerated performative sympathy. "George, sweetheart," Helen cooed, her voice pitched loud enough to ensure the surrounding socialites captured every syllable. She rushed forward, throwing her arms around my shoulders in a loose, theatrical embrace that carefully avoided crushing her own silk garment. "You made it up the stairs. We were so worried the pain would keep you confined to the guest quarters all morning." I kept my gaze lowered to the floorboards. I forced my vocal cords to tremble slightly. "Thank you for having me, Mom," I whispered. Helen turned toward a cluster of women standing near the fireplace. "Look, everyone," she announced, gesturing toward me with a manicured hand. "Our brave girl is here. It has been a harrowing 48 hours, losing her lease so unexpectedly while in the hospital. But family always provides sanctuary. We are just so blessed to have the space to harbor her during this turbulent transition." A chorus of sympathetic murmurs washed over the crowd. A woman I recognized as the charity gala chairwoman offered a patronizing, tight-lipped smile. "It is so generous of you, Helen," the chairwoman stated. "It takes a village to recover from such sudden homelessness." I absorbed the patronizing rhetoric without flinching. I clutched Hazel closer to my chest, letting my shoulders slump inward. They were drinking expensive champagne, toasting their own moral superiority, entirely convinced they were observing a helpless charity case. The dramatic irony tasted like copper on my tongue. Elise glided across the room, inserting herself into the center of the spectacle. She wore a sharp, asymmetrical white dress that highlighted her slender frame. She held a crystal flute filled with orange juice and sparkling wine. Her posture radiated smug, victorious arrogance. She believed the fraudulent wire transfer had satisfied Marcus. She assumed her secrets were permanently buried beneath the ashes of my ruined life. "Hey," Georgie Elise said, offering a faux sympathetic pout. She reached out and patted the top of Hazel's swaddled head. "You look so tired. Are the accommodations downstairs comfortable enough? I know it is not ideal, but you have to admit it beats sleeping in a shelter." The casual cruelty of her statement was designed to humiliate me in front of the audience. She wanted to assert her dominance, cementing her position as the successful sibling, while I languished in the cellar. "It is fine, Elise," I replied, my tone meek and submissive. "I am just grateful to have a roof over my head." Elise smirked, taking a slow, triumphant sip from her glass. "See," she told the surrounding guests, "she is adjusting. We just have to be patient with her recovery." Before the conversation could evolve further, the front door chimed, swinging open to reveal the final, crucial component of this toxic ecosystem. Liam stepped into the foyer. He looked immaculate. He wore a custom-tailored navy blazer over an open-collared dress shirt, projecting the precise aesthetic of a relatable, handsome political candidate. He carried a small, gift-wrapped box, the perfect prop for a concerned father making a public appearance. A man I recognized as his senior campaign manager stood a few paces behind him, observing the room with a calculating, predatory gaze. Liam surveyed the crowd, his eyes eventually locking onto my wrinkled clothing and exhausted posture. A brief, satisfied glint illuminated his expression. He approached our circle, parting the sea of wealthy guests with practiced ease. Helen gasped in delight. "Liam, you came," she exclaimed, reaching out to squeeze his forearm. "I told you I would," Helen Liam replied, his voice rich, warm, and engineered for a microphone. "I know things are incredibly chaotic right now. I wanted to ensure George and the baby were safe." He turned his attention to me. He did not ask to hold his daughter. He stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space under the guise of an intimate greeting. He leaned his head down, bringing his mouth near my ear. The scent of his expensive bergamot aftershave was nauseating. "You look pathetic, George," he whispered, his tone dropping into a cold, venomous register, undetectable to the surrounding audience. "Enjoy the charity brunch. My attorney files the emergency custody petition tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. You will receive the summons by noon. Do not attempt to fight me on this. You have zero capital, zero credibility, and zero permanent addresses. The judge will grant me temporary custody before the ink dries." He pulled back his face, instantly transforming back into a mask of benevolent concern. He smiled warmly at the crowd, placing a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder. I let my eyes widen in simulated terror. I allowed my breathing to hitch, projecting the image of a woman drowning in panic. "Please, Liam," I murmured, keeping my voice fractured. He ignored my plea, turning away to shake hands with a local real estate developer. Thomas hovered near the buffet table, observing the interaction with a look of detached pragmatism. He held the plate of smoked salmon, chewing methodically. He caught my eye across the room. He offered a subtle, dismissive nod, signaling his expectation that I remain quiet and compliant. He believed his envelope of hush money had purchased my permanent subjugation. He assumed I would retreat back to the basement the moment the social obligations concluded. I shifted my weight, resting the heavy canvas diaper bag on the edge of a mahogany side table situated near the center of the living room. I stood near the massive stone fireplace, the architectural focal point of the sprawling space. The guests mingled for another 20 minutes, consuming pastries and draining the mimosa pitchers. The noise level swelled, a cacophony of hollow laughter and superficial networking. The stage was set. Every primary target occupied the same confined perimeter. The audience was primed, their attention focused on the manufactured narrative of family resilience. Helen stepped to the center of the room, standing directly in front of the hearth. She tapped a silver spoon against the rim of her crystal flute. The sharp, high-pitched chime sliced through the ambient chatter. The conversations faded. The guests turned toward the matriarch, anticipating a formal address. "Thank you all for being here today," Helen projected her voice, swelling with theatrical emotion. "Family is the most vital foundation we possess. This week tested our foundation in ways we never expected. My eldest daughter suffered a sudden, tragic housing loss, rendering her and my beautiful new granddaughter displaced." She paused, pressing a manicured hand over her heart, allowing the dramatic tension to build. "But adversity reveals our true character," Helen continued. "We opened our doors. We provided a sanctuary, because that is what families do. We absorb the burdens of those who cannot support themselves. We protect our own." A smattering of polite applause rippled through the crowd. Liam nodded in solemn agreement. Elise smiled, radiating false humility. Thomas raised his glass in a silent toast. I stood next to the mahogany table. I slid my hand into the canvas partition of the diaper bag. My fingers brushed the smooth, cold surface of the black leather folder. I gripped the binding, pulling the heavy presentation portfolio out from beneath the receiving blankets. I set the leather folder down on the polished wood surface. The dull thud echoed in the sudden quiet of the room. The dull thud of the leather portfolio against the mahogany wood went largely unnoticed beneath the swelling applause. Helen beamed, absorbing the adoration of her peers like dry earth drinking rain. She gestured gracefully toward the sprawling dining room, instructing the attendees to find their designated seats for the catered meal. "Come, everyone, let us eat," Helen projected. "George, darling, sit right here at the head. You are our guest of honor today." I retrieved the portfolio, sliding it seamlessly beneath the draped white linen tablecloth as I took my assigned chair. Hazel remained secured against my chest in her fabric carrier, sleeping through the escalating social theater. The guests arranged themselves around the long, polished oak table. Silverware chimed against fine porcelain. Crystal glasses clinked in a continuous, cheerful melody. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms navigated the perimeter, distributing plates of delicate quiche and roasted asparagus. The aroma of rich espresso and melted butter masked the lingering scent of expensive perfumes and stiff hairspray. Elise claimed the seat directly adjacent to my right. She selected a miniature pastry, taking a delicate, measured bite. Her expression conveyed profound self-satisfaction. Growing up, my sister navigated every consequence through charm and misdirection. When she failed a high school chemistry exam, she convinced the instructor the grading rubric was inherently flawed. When she wrecked her first vehicle, she blamed a phantom deer. Accountability never applied to her reality. Today, she believed her unbroken streak of evading consequences remained flawlessly intact. Across the table, Thomas engaged a local real estate developer in a hushed dialogue regarding municipal zoning permits. He ignored my presence entirely. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders loose. He chewed his food with the unbothered rhythm of a man who believed a minor financial transaction had permanently secured his domestic tranquility. To my left, two socialites began discussing my predicament. These were women who spent their mornings organizing charity galas and their afternoons trading illicit neighborhood gossip. They spoke about me in the third person, ignoring the geographical fact that I sat mere inches away. "It is truly tragic," the woman wearing a floral sundress murmured, keeping her voice pitched just high enough for my ears to catch the syllables. Postpartum depression can ravage the mind. To lose a home during such a fragile window, Helen is a saint for taking the poor girl in. Indeed, her companion replied, slicing a thin portion of smoked salmon. I heard she could not manage her personal finances. It is a cautionary tale, really. Single motherhood is a grueling path. One simply must prepare for the unexpected hurdles. I kept my gaze fixed on my empty porcelain plate. I did not correct their fabricated timeline. I allowed them to construct their patronizing narrative, letting the insults slide off my exterior like water over sealed concrete. Underneath the table, my fingertips traced the smooth, rigid edge of the black folder resting upon my knees. The physical texture grounded me in the empirical truth. Inside those bindings lay the Vanguard intelligence metadata. Inside lay the extortion demands typed by a predatory venture capitalist. Inside lay the printed admission of a federal crime committed by Richard Sterling. Liam occupied a chair near Helen, strategically positioning himself near the center of influence. He captivated a small audience of local business owners, his baritone voice resonating with practiced political authority. "We need structural integrity in our community leadership," Liam stated, offering a warm, reassuring smile to a captivated campaign donor. "Our city requires advocates who understand the fundamental importance of a stable household. When we neglect our most vulnerable citizens, the entire social fabric begins to fray. My platform focuses heavily on proactive, familial support." The hypocrisy hung in the air thick and nauseating. The man advocating for proactive familial support had anonymously orchestrated the eviction of his own infant daughter to manufacture a political talking point. He hired private investigators to exploit my sister's illicit corporate espionage. He weaponized our family dynamics to secure a temporary courtroom advantage. He paused his speech to take a sip of his mimosa. He caught my eye from across the elaborate floral centerpiece. He raised his crystal flute in a mocking, silent salute. He believed I was a trapped animal awaiting the inevitable arrival of a process server on Monday morning. The dramatic irony transformed the dining room into a surreal, suffocating pressure cooker. I observed the scene with the detached fascination of a forensic pathologist examining a fatal toxin under a microscope. Every individual sitting at this table believed they possessed the superior vantage point. Helen thought she had secured her undisputed reign as the benevolent, long-suffering matriarch. Elise thought she had erased her corporate theft and buried her infidelity. Thomas thought his envelope of hush money had preserved his pristine logistical empire. Liam thought he had engineered a flawless custody victory to propel his mayoral trajectory. They were toasting to their collective triumph, entirely ignorant of the explosive payload resting upon my lap. The satisfaction blooming inside my chest was cold, sharp, and infinitely potent. I did not need to scream to assert my dominance. I did not require a dramatic emotional outburst to demand basic human respect. I merely needed to wait for the optimal moment of maximum vulnerability. In auditing, timing is just as critical as the data itself. You do not present the discrepancy during the preliminary review. You present the missing capital when the executives are sitting in the boardroom, trapped by their own ledgers. The brunch progressed. Waitstaff cleared the initial plates, replacing them with delicate porcelain cups filled with dark roast coffee. The ambient noise softened as the attendees grew sluggish from the rich cuisine and morning alcohol. The energetic networking shifted into lethargic, comfortable banter. Elise leaned toward me, her breath smelling of citrus and sparkling wine. "You should eat something, Georgie," she whispered, her tone laced with condescending pity. "You look terrible." Mom was right. You need to focus on your mental health. Let the adults handle the complicated logistics from here on out. I turned my head, meeting her gaze. For the first time since entering the house, I did not mask my expression. I let the hollow, defeated facade drop. I stared at her with the cold, unblinking assessment of an investigator who has just located the stolen assets. Elise faltered. Her smirk vanished. A flicker of genuine unease passed through her eyes. She shifted backward in her upholstered chair, suddenly unnerved by my profound silence. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. At the far end of the long table, Helen stood once more. She smoothed the front of her peach dress, preparing to deliver the culminating address of her social performance. Friends, Helen projected, drawing the attention of the room. Before we conclude this wonderful gathering, I want to propose one final toast. The guests raised their glasses, the crystal catching the bright morning sunlight streaming through the bay windows. The room quieted, everyone turning their attention toward the head of the household. To family unity, Helen declared, her voice ringing with fabricated sincerity. To the bonds that anchor us during the darkest storms, and to the unwavering resilience of our bloodline. To family, the room echoed in unison. I did not raise a glass. I slid my hands under the linen tablecloth. My thumbs found the small brass button securing the leather folder. I unclasped the binding. The chorus of the toast faded into the high ceiling of the dining room. Crystal flutes lowered to the pristine linen tablecloth. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor, an abrasive sound that severed the polite atmosphere. I stood. I did not cradle Hazel, leaving her secure in the fabric carrier strapped to my chest. I grasped the black leather portfolio. I bypassed Elise without a glance. I walked the length of the formal dining table, my flat shoes moving silently over the Persian rugs. I reached the head of the table, standing directly beside my mother. Helen maintained her frozen, camera-ready smile, though her eyes darted toward the portfolio with a flicker of apprehension. I rested the heavy leather binding onto the center of the mahogany table. The dull thud resonated in the quiet room. I unclasped the brass button. I did not raise my voice. I did not launch into a theatrical monologue. Auditors do not rely on impassioned speeches. We let the documentation speak. I extracted the first tabbed packet. It contained the Vanguard Intelligence metadata analysis paired with the blistering legal counterclaim Evelyn Thorne had finalized. I slid the thick stack of watermarked paper across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Liam. Liam maintained his charismatic, confident posture for a fraction of a second. He lowered his gaze to the top page. The bold heading detailed his collusion with a predatory venture capitalist. It outlined his deliberate manipulation of my housing stability to manufacture a fraudulent custody petition. His eyes scanned the first paragraph. The warm political tan drained from his face, leaving his complexion the color of wet cement. "I know you prefer to operate through anonymous proxies, Liam," I stated, my tone measuring barely above a whisper, yet carrying across the silent room. But metadata is remarkably stubborn. My attorney filed this counterclaim 20 minutes ago. We subpoenaed your campaign manager and the Vanguard operatives. Liam stared at the paper. The local business owners and political donors seated around him leaned forward, their curiosity piqued by the shift in his demeanor. He closed his mouth, the smooth baritone voice failing him entirely. He understood the lethal nature of the document. A family values candidate cannot survive a public discovery phase detailing the premeditated eviction of his own infant daughter. I turned my attention to my brother. Thomas sat with his arms crossed, a picture of detached arrogance, believing his envelope of cash shielded him from the fallout. I pulled the second packet from the portfolio. This section contained the high-resolution surveillance photographs, the Delaware Shell Company routing numbers, and the printed extortion demands. I placed the file next to his plate of smoked salmon. Thomas unfolded his arms. He flipped open the cover. The top page displayed the crisp, undeniable image of Elise embracing Marcus outside the downtown hotel. The second page detailed the specific proprietary marketing algorithms Elise had stolen. The third page displayed the blackmail ultimatum issued by his trusted business partner. I watched the cognitive gears grind behind his eyes. Thomas is a man who calculates risk. He saw the affair. He saw the corporate espionage. He recognized that his sister had compromised his logistics firm to fund her illicit lifestyle. The pristine, frictionless world he valued above all else shattered in real time. The color flushed into his cheeks, a dark, dangerous red. He did not look at me. He slowly lifted his head and fixed a gaze of pure, unfiltered rage upon Elise. The guests shifted in their seats, the collective tension thickening the air. They sensed the collapse of the social order. I retrieved a stack of single-sheet printouts. They were copies of the internal communication log I had acquired from Brenda. The text detailed Richard Sterling's explicit admission of accepting a bribe to bypass the digital signature verification. I handed the stack to the country club chairwoman seated to my left. I asked her to pass them down the table. The socialites took the papers, their eyes scanning the black and white text. The whispered murmurs started almost immediately. The fabricated narrative of the unstable, destitute daughter dissolved as they read the empirical proof of a coordinated eviction. The room absorbed the reality that the woman they were pitying had been systematically robbed by her own sister. Helen clutched her strand of authentic pearls. Her peach sheath dress seemed to swallow her shrinking posture. The performance was unraveling in front of her most coveted audience. She reached out her fingers, trembling, trying to grab the printed text logs from the nearest guest. "This is a fabrication," Helen stammered, her voice pitched high and erratic. "She is unwell. George, stop this instantly. You are embarrassing yourself. You are ruining the brunch." The denial was hollow. The ink on the page was resolute, her face mottled into a deep, uneven purple, the physical manifestation of her evaporating social currency. At the far end of the table, the reality of the trap finally snapped shut around Elise. She looked at Thomas, witnessing the lethal fury radiating from her brother. She looked at the socialites, watching them read the details of her felony wire fraud. The smug, victorious smirk melted off her face. Elise opened her mouth and began to wail. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a shrill, panic-stricken sound of a cornered animal realizing the exits are sealed. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning white, gasping for air between jagged sobs. She tried to formulate an excuse, a lie, any misdirection to shield herself from the impending consequences. The words failed to materialize. The room remained dead silent, save for the jarring, pathetic sound of her breakdown. No one rushed to comfort her. The audience merely stared, repulsed by the raw display of guilt. I reached into the canvas diaper bag one final time. I bypassed the leather portfolio and withdrew a thick manila envelope. The heavy mahogany doors leading into the formal study opened. A man stepped into the dining room. He wore a standard gray suit, his posture rigid and observant. He was not a guest. Evelyn Thorne had coordinated his arrival, timing his entry with the conclusion of the meal. He was a detective assigned to the Marion County Financial Crimes Division. I walked away from the head of the table. I approached the detective, my flat shoes gliding silently over the hardwood. I handed him the manila envelope. "This is the comprehensive criminal referral," I stated, keeping my voice clinical and detached. "It contains the verified IP, routing data, the extortion correspondence, and the documentation of the unauthorized wire transfer. The perpetrator is seated at the table." The detective accepted the file, his eyes sweeping across the frozen faces of the brunch attendees. He offered a curt, professional nod. Behind me, the fragile ecosystem imploded. Thomas stood up, his chair crashing backward onto the Persian rug. He pointed a trembling finger at Elise, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "You stole from Marcus Thomas," roared, abandoning his carefully curated corporate demeanor. "You dragged my company into your reckless extortion scheme. I will not spend a single dollar defending you in court. You are on your own." Elise wailed louder, reaching a hand out toward Helen. But Helen took a deliberate step backward, distancing herself from the radioactive fallout. The matriarch who demanded family unity above all else abandoned her favorite daughter to preserve whatever microscopic shred of dignity remained. Liam did not speak. He stood quietly, leaving his gift-wrapped box on the table. He turned on his heel and walked out the front door, his campaign manager trailing closely behind. His retreat was swift and definitive, an unspoken surrender. The socialites began gathering their designer handbags, whispering frantically to one another as they rushed toward the foyer. The charity brunch had transformed into a crime scene, and they sought immediate evacuation. I stood near the study doors, holding Hazel close to my chest. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched the architects of my ruin turn on each other with brutal, predictable efficiency. The ledger was balanced. The aftermath of the detonation unfolded with the sterile efficiency of a corporate liquidation. The detective from the Financial Crimes Division did not raise his voice. He did not issue dramatic warnings. He simply opened the manila envelope, reviewed the attached bank routing numbers against the surveillance photographs, and approached the far end of the dining table. Elise sat paralyzed in her chair. The veneer of her untouchable arrogance had shattered, leaving behind a fragile, trembling shell. The detective requested she stand. He informed her she was being detained under suspicion of felony identity theft and wire fraud. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists resonated through the vaulted ceiling, a sharp, definitive sound that finalized the shift in power. Helen retreated into the hallway, refusing to look at her golden child. The matriarch, who had built her entire identity on public perception, could not bear to witness the destruction of her curated image. She abandoned Elise to the judicial system, preserving her own fragile ego. Thomas had already exited through the kitchen, severing his ties to his sister the moment her actions threatened his logistics firm. I did not stay to watch the detective escort Elise out the front door. I gathered my canvas bag, adjusted the carrier holding Hazel against my chest, and walked out of the house. The humid Indiana air tasted crisp and clean in my lungs. The rideshare vehicle I had kept waiting at the curb idled quietly. I climbed inside, leaving the sprawling brick fortress and the toxic ecosystem behind me forever. The legal machinery engaged the following morning. Monday arrived with a heavy gray overcast, a fitting backdrop for the bureaucratic warfare scheduled at the Marion County Courthouse. I sat in a secluded conference room alongside Evelyn Thorne. We did not wait for a judge to call the docket. Evelyn had summoned Liam's primary campaign counsel for a private mediation an hour before the emergency custody hearing was slated to begin. Liam's attorney entered the room carrying a thick leather briefcase, projecting an aura of seasoned, impenetrable confidence. He assumed he was negotiating with a destitute mother desperate for visitation rights. He sat across the long mahogany table, straightening his silk tie. My client is prepared to offer supervised weekend visitation. The attorney began, his tone laced with patronizing generosity. Considering your current lack of a fixed address and the turbulent events at your family home yesterday, we feel this is the most secure path forward for the child. Evelyn did not verbally respond. She reached into her briefcase and extracted a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the polished wood. It was a drafted press release. The headline detailed a local political candidate orchestrating the illegal eviction of his infant daughter to manufacture a family court crisis. The body of the text referenced the Vanguard intelligence metadata outlining the exact timeline of the corporate extortion scheme Liam had facilitated. It named Marcus. It named the Delaware Shell Company. Liam's attorney read the document. The seasoned confidence evaporated from his features, replaced by a rigid, calculating terror. He understood the lethal nature of the ink on the page. You file that custody petition. Evelyn stated, her voice sharp and unyielding. And I distribute this release to every major news outlet in the state of Indiana by 10 o'clock. We will subpoena Vanguard. We will open his entire campaign apparatus to a brutal public discovery phase. Your client will not just lose his election. He will face an investigation for malicious prosecution. The attorney stared at the press release for a long, silent minute. He recognized a checkmate. He stood up, closed his briefcase, and nodded once. The petition is withdrawn with prejudice, he murmured. You will not hear from my client again. He left the room. The primary threat to my daughter vanished, erased by the undeniable power of forensic leverage. The final reckoning occurred on Tuesday afternoon, situated within the pristine, glass-walled confines of Evelyn's downtown office. Richard Sterling arrived, accompanied by a frantic, sweating corporate lawyer. The landlord, who had arrogantly dismissed my phone call mere days ago, now sat trembling in a leather chair. The swagger had bled out of him, replaced by the profound panic of a man staring at a federal indictment. Evelyn did not negotiate. She dictated terms. She laid out the printed text messages acquired from Brenda alongside the drafted complaint for the State Real Estate Commission. She explained the mechanical process of how a wire fraud conviction would strip him of his broker's license, freeze his operating accounts, and result in a mandatory prison sentence. Sterling dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What do you want?" he pleaded, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I will refund the deposit. I will pay damages. Just keep this out of federal court." A refund does not compensate for the psychological trauma of rendering a newborn homeless, Evelyn countered. "My client requires equitable restitution. You currently hold the deed to a vacant 3-bedroom townhouse in the Carmel School District. The property is owned free and clear by your primary holding company. You will sign the deed over to George Ember today. You will cover all closing costs and transfer taxes. In exchange, we will seal the communication logs and withhold the demand notice from the State Commission." Sterling's lawyer attempted to protest the exorbitant demand, but Sterling silenced him with a frantic wave of his hand. The cost of a single townhouse was a fractional penalty compared to the total annihilation of his entire real estate portfolio and his personal freedom. He requested a pen. He signed the transfer documents with a shaking hand, legally surrendering a prime piece of suburban real estate to avoid wearing a prison uniform. The resolution was clinical, efficient, and irreversible. 2 weeks later, the dust settled over the ruined landscape of my former family. Elise faced multiple felony charges. The corporate espionage revelation destroyed her professional career. Marcus, seeking to distance himself from the legal fallout, terminated his partnership with Thomas. The resulting financial fracture severely damaged the logistics firm. Thomas, desperate to salvage his remaining equity, cut all contact with his sister and his mother. Helen found herself socially ostracized. The country club elite, terrified of being associated with a high-profile criminal scandal, stopped returning her phone calls. Bankrupt from mounting legal defense fees and abandoned by her network, Elise was forced to vacate her luxury apartment. She had 0 remaining assets and no viable income stream. She pleaded with Helen for shelter. Helen, unwilling to sacrifice her own comfort but desperate to maintain some illusion of maternal duty, allowed Elise to move back into the family home. She placed Elise in the finished basement. I stood on the wraparound porch of my new Carmel townhouse. The neighborhood was quiet, characterized by mature oak trees and pristine sidewalks. The air felt light, untainted by the heavy, suffocating expectations of my past. Hazel slept soundly in a bassinet stationed near the front window, safe behind locked doors I owned outright. I held a mug of hot coffee, watching the morning sun filter through the leaves. I pictured the dark, damp cellar on the other side of the city. I visualized Elise shivering next to the humming furnace, sleeping on the sagging, discarded sofa she had once relegated me to. She was trapped in the exact subterranean prison she had engineered for my ruin. The justice was poetic, precise, and permanent. They believed they could strip my assets because they viewed me as a passive variable. They assumed my exhaustion would override my analytical training. They gambled their reputations and their freedom on the premise that I would absorb their crimes to preserve a toxic peace. They orchestrated a complex fraud, hiding behind shell companies, political proxies, and fabricated medical emergencies. They thought they could liquidate my life because they never bothered to do the math. They forgot I am the one who audits the ledger. We all maintain silent ledgers within the walls of our childhood homes. We tally the debts of affection, the unkept promises, and the quiet moments of betrayal that shape our understanding of love. In the traditional American family structure, we are taught to revere the home as an impenetrable sanctuary. It is supposed to be the one geographical location on this earth where our worth is inherent, not negotiated. But what happens when the architects of that sanctuary view love as a finite, transactional currency? The saga of a daughter betrayed in the delivery room, her life savings liquidated to cover the sins of a sibling, is more than a thrilling chronicle of forensic retribution. It is a profound, sobering mirror held up to the darkest corners of modern parenting. It forces us to examine the catastrophic consequences of raising children without the fundamental pillars of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. Consider the matriarch of this shattered ecosystem. She represents a pervasive, quiet tragedy woven into the fabric of affluent society. The parent who values the reflection in the country club mirror more than the structural integrity of her own family. When a parent prioritizes optics over accountability, they are actively crippling their children. By shielding the favored child from the natural consequences of her actions, whether it is a stolen science fair project or a complex extortion scheme, a parent cultivates a predator. The golden child learns that the rules of morality are malleable, that charm supersedes integrity, and that their mistakes will always be absorbed by someone else. This dynamic reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of family responsibility. True guidance is not about engineering a frictionless existence for our children. It is about allowing them to fail safely, holding them accountable when they cause harm, and teaching them that their actions carry weight in the real world. When we deny a child the opportunity to clean up their own wreckage, we rob them of the chance to develop genuine empathy. We raise adults who know how to smile for a holiday photograph, but who lack the emotional vocabulary to navigate a crisis without destroying the people closest to them. Conversely, this toxic dynamic demands a designated shock absorber, the strong child, the one who is praised for their resilience, not because their resilience is admired, but because their resilience is convenient. How many of us have heard those suffocating words, "You will figure it out. You are the strong one." It is the ultimate parental abdication of duty dressed up as a compliment. It is the insidious process of emotional outsourcing, where the capable child is penalized for their stability, expected to surrender their resources, their boundaries, and even their homes to subsidize the dysfunction of the rest of the bloodline. Raising children within a healthy traditional structure requires a fierce commitment to fairness. Fairness does not mean identical treatment. It means applying the same moral baseline to every member of the household. It means recognizing that the quiet, independent child requires just as much emotional safety and advocacy as the loud, demanding one. When a family operates on a tiered system of justice, where the favored are forgiven and the capable are exploited, the foundation rots from the inside out. The climax of our narrative, the elegant, catered Sunday brunch that transformed into a public execution, serves as a striking metaphor for the modern American obsession with performative unity. We dress our wounds in pastel linen. We toast to resilience while actively silencing the victims sitting at our own dining tables. But emotional awareness requires us to dismantle the stage. It demands that we sit in the uncomfortable, messy, unpolished truth of our familial flaws. A family cannot heal if it refuses to acknowledge the disease. The matriarch lost her entire family, not because she lacked wealth or social standing, but because she lacked the courage to look at her favorite daughter and say no. When a mother looks down at her newborn daughter resting against her chest in the cold, sterile light of a hospital room, she is staring at a blank ledger. That tiny, fragile life represents the profound opportunity to break a generational curse. It is the chance to build a new ecosystem governed by transparency, where love is freely given rather than conditionally leased. Long-term guidance means teaching that child that her worth is not determined by her utility to others. It means showing her that boundaries are acts of profound self-respect. The protagonist did not seek vengeance for the thrill of the kill. She executed a clinical, necessary demolition to clear the contaminated soil, ensuring her daughter would never have to grow up breathing the toxic air of a gaslit household. She traded the illusion of a grand, connected, extended family for the quiet, unshakable peace of a home built on truth. Sometimes, the most profound act of parenting is deciding which doors to permanently lock, ensuring the predators of our past cannot access our future. We all have a basement in our family history, a damp, dark place where we bury the uncomfortable truths, the hushed scandals, and the quiet inequities that we pretend do not exist. We sweep the betrayals under the rug, hoping the foundation holds for one more generation. But the foundation always cracks. The ledger always demands balancing. If this journey through the shadowed halls of family betrayal resonated with you, if you have ever been the strong one expected to carry the weight of a broken ecosystem, you are not alone in the dark. We explore these complex, unpolished truths every week, shining a light on the stories that demand to be heard. I encourage you to follow the channel, Linda Vengeance. Join our community, share your own experiences in the comments, and hit subscribe so you never miss a moment of the reckoning. As the screen fades to black and the quiet settles into your own living room, take a moment to look around the walls of your sanctuary. Listen to the floorboards. What truths are you keeping hidden in the cellar of your own life? Are you building a home based on the rigorous, beautiful demands of honesty? Or are you merely arranging the furniture over a hollow floor, waiting for the day someone finally decides to audit the ledger?